3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning to you. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do you ever get that feeling where you sort of think that there's a guiding hand above us? It's like, 'cause some of the stories I've got in front of me today, they could almost, if I was a bit better at this job, I could almost knit them together. So, some of them. So you've got a story that we're about to pile in on, which looks at the increase in malnutrition cases. In 21st century Britain, malnutrition cases presenting at British hospitals. I'll try to get near to the bottom of that shortly. But would you believe that on the same day, in the same news agenda, I also have a story about the head of Haribo saying that the interference by ministers is damaging his business. In other words, if you were to report it slightly differently, the legislation brought in to stop supermarkets putting confectionery in the pesta sweet spot. There's not a parent alive who doesn't know what that's like. Could you imagine anything more infernal than putting the sweets right next to the till when you're queuing up and your little treasures? So that fits a bit with the malnutrition story. There are calls to put calorie counts on your pint. I don't know how I feel about that. I'm not sure I'm going to find out how you feel about that, because I don't think we're going to talk about it. And then the two other stories sort of linked to wealth, because I suspect that some of the malnutrition cases that we're about to explore will, of course, be linked to wealth. I'm poised at the moment to spend an hour asking you to feel sorry for landlords. That's something that is very rarely done in the context of this programme, certainly. But 225,000 of them could be facing losses as the cost of refinancing mortgages continues to escalate. And I think it's time for a grown-up conversation about what that will actually mean. Because, listen, you might subscribe to a slightly Wolfie Smith school of thought regarding landlords, and I think I used to. You forgot what it was like to be a tenant when you didn't want to be a homeowner. The story's changed slightly now because so many people would love to be but can't. But if a landlord gets smacked, what is it they used to say about Britain and America? If America sneezes, Britain catches a cold, or something like that. If a landlord sneezes, the tenants catch a cold, don't they? So it's silly not to look at that story at least through a similar lens through which we look at the stories about homeowners suffering from interest rate rises and mortgage escalations. And then, of course, you have this story. I don't know how interesting you find it. I really don't. Because the problem with the UK media is if you're over 50, probably more so over 60, you're still in a position of power, or you've risen to a well-rewarded role in the UK media, by which I mean either you're lucky enough to have a big show on a big station, or you've got a column in a newspaper, or you've got an executive role, then you are probably sending your children to a fee-paying school. So that's why I think conversations about private education and the Labour plan to strip them of their charitable status, which means that the fees would have to include VAT, I suspect it might be a lot more fascinating to the upper echelons of the media class than it is to the country as a whole. But unfortunately, I'm a member of the upper echelons of the media class, and I find it absolutely fascinating. So we're probably going to have a look at that story later. I would remind you, though, that very often it's the people who tell you that if you can't afford to feed your children, this is why it's relevant to the rickets story, if you can't afford to feed your children, it's time you got a better job, turn out to be exactly the same people who say if you can't afford to send your children to private school, you need a government-funded tax break on your school fees. Sometimes I envy the more hard of thinking right wingers, because life must seem so simple. You're sort of 30p Lee and that lot. If you don't need food banks, get a better job, you can eat for 30p, and then the private education story comes along and they're on the side of parents demanding that we have state-funded subsidies for people at private schools. I don't know. We'll have a look. Anyway, the story's interesting because the numbers appear to be negligible. Considerably fewer children will be, quotes, forced out, end quotes, of private school than landlords will be perhaps forced out of renting homes as a consequence of interest rates. But anyway, listen, I've got no clue about this one. I've got absolutely no clue about this one. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. Let me tell you what the early signs are on the in the inbox. Rickets and scurvy may not be directly linked to wealth, but they are directly linked to diet, says John in Newton-le-Willows. So there is an indirect link because people's diet will be predetermined by the amount of money they have to spend on food. You're absolutely right. Dr. Claire Gerarda of the Royal College of GPs says that the tea and toast diet of poverty-stricken OAPs may be contributing to the rise in malnutrition admissions. And I think Pete's ahead at the moment when he says, James, are people coming down with Victorian diseases in order to help Jacob Rees-Mogg feel more like he's living in the correct era? Yes. So here's the story. 11,000 people in England, this is just England actually, were hospitalised with malnutrition last year. Doctors are warning that the cost of living crisis has also led to a rise in Victorian illnesses, such as, well, you heard it, scurvy and rickets. Now, scurvy is a deficiency of vitamin C, and rickets is a prolonged deficiency of vitamin D. So the first would be typically in the elderly, and the second typically in children. There's something very arresting about the idea of this country, perhaps this economy, which they keep telling us is the fifth or sixth biggest in the world, a relatively meaningless metric, I think we could probably all agree. Watching an exponential rise in the number of, well, it's doubled in a decade, more than doubled in a decade, the number of people being hospitalised with malnutrition. Okay. Now, the reason I say I don't know quite how to handle this story is because the numbers aren't huge. 11,000 people is 11,000 too many, but it is hardly evidence of an epidemic or a pandemic of malnutrition. However, these are the ones that end up in hospital, so we can be fairly confident that I'm talking about landlords later. Stop ringing me about landlords. We're doing landlords later. Later for the landlords, ladies and gentlemen. So you can be fairly confident that some people will be suffering from these conditions or suffering somehow while not necessarily reaching the point of hospitalisation. The phrase that struck me was the tea and toast. The tea and toast description deployed by Dr. Claire Gerarda, the president of the Royal College of GPs, who suggested that the tea and toast diet of poverty-stricken OAPs may be contributing to the rise in malnutrition admissions. So 171 people treated for scurvy, 482 patients admitted with rickets, 405 of them children. Malnutrition, of course, is also going to include people who are simply not eating enough food. And while some imported data may be there from people newly arrived in this country, refugees, for example, who've been to hell and back, and as a consequence of that are suffering from malnutrition. But the numbers are too big for that to be the main driver. Gerarda said, if this is indicative of the health of our most vulnerable, then it is shocking. The poorest people in the country are poorer than any other counterparts in Europe, and it's poor diet. The most common reason a child under 5 has a general anaesthetic now is for dental care, which is also a sign of malnutrition. So how do we do it? That's what I'd like to ask you. How do we do it? What do you think? There's no way many of us are going to have a proper handle on what exactly is happening. So I think we can have a slightly speculative chat this morning. I don't think you'd want to ring me if you were an old age pensioner living on toast. I think that your dignity and your generation perhaps would make it very hard for you to have that conversation. But perhaps someone you know is in that sort of situation. You have to get this right, don't you? Because you don't want to make it sound voyeuristic. But have you been stunned to discover what someone you know is living on? 0345 6060 973. So I think what you'd get is the actual conditions, the rickets, the scurvy, the malnutrition, are the finish line on this story. And I'm interested in everybody on the track. So you found out that perhaps one of your neighbours was living on tinned soup, or one of your children's friends was suffering from scurvy. The absence of vitamin C, that's more likely to be older people, but the vitamin D, that's partly sunlight as well. I think I'm interested in people who are subsisting on an absolutely rotten diet. Okay? And given that we now know people in this country are poorer than their own counterparts anywhere else in Europe, you can't help wondering whether it is entirely accidental, you know. And by that, I don't mean it's been done on purpose. I mean that nothing has really been done to stop it. One of the things I found a little bit, and don't think I've gone all undergraduate, but one of the things that I found a little bit difficult about the coverage of George Osborne's wedding and the sympathy expressed when somebody threw some confetti at him. And I get that. You wouldn't wish that on anyone. Nobody would want their own wedding to be invaded in that way. But I was surprised by the prioritisation of sympathy when you consider that he was Chancellor of the Exchequer throughout the period of austerity that, according to some measures, left hundreds of thousands of people dead unnecessarily, never mind all the people it left hungry or poorly supported. But you know, that was yesterday's news. Today's news is the malnutrition, and today's question is, how is this happening? How is this happening? 0345 6060 973. Okay, how do you think? Because I'm not going to be holding your feet to the fire on this one if you haven't got the evidence or the proof or the absolute conclusive evidence. Why do you think that this is happening? And have you come across it? Have you encountered people whose diet you discovered was more Victorian than Jacob Rees-Mogg? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Now, it isn't going to lead to a sort of Victorian style disaster, because you can take tablets and you can get vitamin supplements. But again, Claire Gerarda says it's a sad environment that we have to sort out poverty by giving out vitamin supplements. And if you're a parent, right, do you know that your child's diet is pretty grim, but you believe you can't afford to provide healthier food? This is one of the great conundrums of commercialism, isn't it, of modern marketing, is that it is actually cheaper to buy processed food than fresh food. Because I think the best way to understand it, and it only came to us quite recently, didn't it? Do you remember? It was halfway through a phone-in. Think of a drug dealer, right, who has got, I don't know, 10 kilos of pure cocaine. By the time that stuff hits the streets, he's got 20 kilos of cocaine. So processed food, you think about in exactly the same way. They're doing stuff to it and putting stuff into it that makes the healthy value. I'm not suggesting cocaine is healthy, but bear with me. It makes the original ingredient go much, much further in return for much, much more money. So that solves the mystery of why a ready meal lasagna will be cheaper than making your own from fresh ingredients, right? Because of all the stuff that's in it. That's how it works. Because I, as a dad, I have nothing but sympathy for you. I don't know how do you deal with the fact that you know that you're feeding your children an unhealthy diet? There's a lot to get our teeth into here. You see what I did there? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And finally, I guess, if you're working in this field, if you're in the front line, I'd love to know what you're coming across. Stuff that perhaps you wouldn't have encountered 20 years ago. You can't quite believe it when you find a family who are having shredded wheat, own brand shredded wheat for the evening meal. I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating or embellishing, but we will find out. The phone lines are open, and I am looking forward, as I always do, to hearing from you. It is 20 minutes after 10. It is a country that we are frequently reminded enjoys the fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, but it's also a country where malnutrition is on the rise, and I just wonder why. Rufus is in Stanmore. Rufus, what can you tell us?
I'd like to link the vitamin D problem to austerity.
Yes.
Government austerity. For about 20 years, the Department of Health has said we only need about 1/5 level of vitamin D in our blood that we really ought to have.
Oh, okay. What do you base your position on?
I've been attending the scientific committees that advise the ministers, and they've said we need more, but the Department of Health, in order to save money, decided to keep the level much lower.
Okay. In what capacity do you attend these meetings, if you don't mind me asking?
I call myself a citizen scientist.
Okay.
I organise some medical conferences about vitamin D, so I'm knowledgeable.
No, okay. I just checking, because I've heard that several times, that vitamin D levels are generally much lower than they should be. How does it save the government money, Rufus? If that's not a stupid question.
Well, if the government in the NHS said, well, if you have a blood test for vitamin D.
Yeah.
And your result comes out below 25 whatevers, then the doctor must write a prescription. If it comes out at 26, then the doctor says, no problem, no need to do anything. Actually, we need between 100 and 150 for good health.
So they save money on prescriptions, on vitamin D supplements?
Yes. And then they give rubbish advice that says we only need to take 10 micrograms of vitamin D, whether you're a baby or a 100-kilogram person.
Right.
And that is utterly nonsense.
So it's an area of great ignorance then, really. Some of it you would argue willful. These changes didn't come in as a consequence of austerity, did they? They've been here for a while.
Well, actually, they go back about 25 years when the Department of Health did it to save money.
Yes. On the number of people that were being prescribed vitamin D supplements.
Yes.
Okay.
And then failed to give proper public health advice.
Yeah. I'm not going to argue with you, but the situation's got worse in the last year or two, not in the last 25 years. Things were going all right until relatively recently. So the last decade this has kicked in. Is there much vitamin D in milk? Would taking free milk in schools away have had an impact on this as well?
In America, they fortify it. In the UK, we don't.
Oh, okay.
So there is no vitamin D in milk. Okay.
So it is possibly pragmatic, possibly cynical, but a widespread under-appreciation of where your vitamin D levels should be, and therefore the worst-case scenario would be a child getting rickets.
Yes.
Thank you, Rufus. I like citizen scientists. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. Richard's in Birmingham. Richard, what do you think? Richard?
Hello?
Hello, mate. You're on the radio. What would you like to say? Well, that went well. Alison's in the Chilterns. Alison, what would you like to say?
Well, from what I've experienced, I'm 60 years old. When I was at school, they used to teach us about nutrition, the right foods to eat. I'm not convinced they teach that as much at school anymore. I see friends and family with what they feed their children. Some have good diets, but I see a lot of people eating fast foods. They don't eat fruit and veg. They stay indoors.
There's quite a lot of veg in a burger, actually. Surprising amount when you think about it. But there's sugar and fat and salt as well.
Sugar, fat and carbs.
But that's not going to give you. That's not going to give you rickets. You don't really. Did you eat much fruit as a child? I think Mum had to force it down my throat.
I was forced it.
Yeah, that doesn't seem to be. They give it away free in Morrison's. There's a little bucket in Morrison's where children can help themselves to an apple or a banana, and I see them doing it. They got the novelty, of course, of free stuff as well. But,
yeah, of course.
But I don't know.
Children are just eating fast food and convenience foods. A lot of older people are eating ready-made meals. They're not cooking from fresh anymore like they used to. The amount of young people...
I'm not so... you must have had Finder's pancakes and Vesta curries, and we had,
probably once or twice when they first came out as a novelty. But
well, they wouldn't have stayed in the shops for years if people weren't eating them. I'm sure that there is more of it than there used to be, but I don't, and I think it's probably a contributor to obesity. But rickets and scurvy, I'm just not sure it would be.
Well, scurvy would be they're not having enough vitamin C. That is diet. They're not eating the right food. I've been involved in food all my life, so
haven't we all?
My career. So
Yes.
I know that the nutritional benefits of food, but I don't think people do actually understand that you are what you eat. And I don't think they really understand.
No, you're obviously right. Things have declined and teaching has diminished, and companies have been given free rein to bombard us with stuff that's actually very bad for us. The vitamin D is interesting. I think a lot of us have got vitamin D deficiency and we just don't know about it. It contributes to fatigue. It contributes to general well-being, never mind the point at which it might be contributing to rickets. So I'd say sort of looking at some of the numbers and you find yourself wondering what's changed in the last 10 years, because I don't think it's going to be the necessarily the old junk food argument, but what is it going to be? Stuart's in Harlow. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I listen to you nearly every day, and I've never called before.
Well,
so
hang
go
on.
easy on me.
Back up a minute, right? Let's start with the nearly, shall we? What's that all about?
Well, if I'm doing something and I can't get to a radio, then I can't hear you.
What can you possibly be
working.
doing?
I can't
put it in your ear
if I'm working.
Put a headphone in your ear. What's to stop you putting a little earbud? No one will notice.
Yeah, mate. I'll try it, James.
Thank you.
I'll try it.
Thank you. Now carry on.
I wanted to say I agree completely with your last caller, and I agree with what you just said about companies. We're lied to, James, and the foods that we buy are not necessarily what we think we're eating. So, for example, do you use olive oil, extra virgin olive oil?
Yeah, but don't go all weird and tinfoil hat on me.
Okay, why?
Well, I like it. What's wrong with extra virgin olive oil? They've been consuming
Nothing.
it. Oh, good. Right, fine.
Nothing at all, James.
Good.
If that's what's in that bottle.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes.
And they mix vegetable oils in and oils that are really bad for the heart. They mix in with it, so you have to do the research.
They can do, but you can read the ingredients, and then you've got trading standards. There were big stories a couple of years ago, weren't there, about Italian mafiosi getting into the olive oil trade and the balsamic vinegar trade and the honey trade, actually, and packing out with all sorts of things. But I don't really think that's going to be a major contributor to rickets or scurvy, Stuart.
No, but when you talk about malnutrition,
yes.
We need to know what we're eating. And when you talk about vitamin D, probably most people are actually deficient in vitamin D anyway.
Why?
So, because we just don't get enough in this country because we don't have enough sun.
But that was always true. We've got more sun than ever. What are you talking about? We've got more sun than ever in this country now. So it can't be that.
It's nice today. But then when you take a vitamin D supplement, you've got to take it with K2, so that the vitamin D goes to where it should do, i.e. in the bones, and not to fill your arteries.
Getting fully absorbed.
Yeah, exactly. It goes to the wrong place. So I just wish we were educated more and we were not led by the great big farmers and the pharmaceutical companies and the supermarkets, where, as you rightly said, the cheapest food to buy is all the rubbish food.
Well, yes and no. I've been picked up by someone who does know of what he speaks. One of the countries DM'd me, so I won't identify him, but one of the country's leading botanists suggesting that actually dietitians would disagree with some of that analysis that I, like you, Stuart, thought was pretty much established. But the idea that there's a established consensus on processed food. Sometimes it is economies of scale that renders it really cheap, and it can actually be a little bit healthier sometimes in terms of fat, sugar, and salt than stuff you've made yourself. But we're all on a journey. We're all sitting somewhere on the learning curve. Coming up to 10:30, quite a lot of people listening to this have got vitamin D deficiencies. Is it going to be as simple as suggesting that you're not playing outside as much? I think it might be, actually. So it's all very well me saying, it's sunnier than ever. But Stuart's right, isn't it? I mean, you do not now. We touched on this yesterday. I've got very conscious. Should we get an alarm if we start sounding like we're harking back to the good old days? If so, we get a back in my day alarm. Should we get a back in my day alarm? And it just goes off in the background. No one triggers it. It just happens automatically. We get ChatGPT programmed up or something. But back in my day, you did spend the whole summer holidays outside, didn't you? All of them. Every living minute, even if it was raining. I used to have 5-day test matches in my back garden with my mate from up the road. So I do think we were outdoors a lot more, but maybe that's a bit simplistic. Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines. It's 33 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The biggest two issues with vitamin D, says Tom in Guildford, are, and this tallies with a lot of what I'm receiving this morning, the sun is only strong enough to metabolise it in our skin for about 7 months of the year. And secondly, a person of colour is at far greater risk. So yes, we can get vitamin D in the summer, but not at all in the winter. I think Rufus, the first caller, is probably going to be vindicated this hour, because it seems to me, just looking at this, that everybody should be taking some form of vitamin D supplement and making sure that they're taking the right kind as well, the kind that gets into your bones, into your system. So the symptoms of a vitamin D deficiency are quite interesting, because it's perfectly possible you have it, but you just don't notice. You're a long way from actually going to hospital with a case of rickets, but you're somewhere on the path towards that direction. Would you believe I take vitamin D supplements? And I remember almost every day. And I think it's made a difference to my general sort of alertness and joint pain. It's like, oh dear, I nearly did it there. The back in my day alarm nearly went off. But I'd take quite schmancy ones, because Mrs. O'Brien's really into that sort of thing. And I take quite schmancy ones, because she was telling me that some of the ones that you might buy in your chemist, the normal stuff, isn't as effective. But I mean, how do you know for sure that it's working? And then, of course, a lot of you pointing out we slather ourselves in sun cream. A couple of people claiming that because they're covered in tattoos, they're more at risk of a vitamin D deficiency. Is that right? Does a tattoo limit your ability to absorb vitamin D? So far, though, we've got no one with scurvy. Now, I don't want to sound sensationalist or cynical, but I think the jackpot today would be someone with scurvy. 0345 6060 973. I won't do any pirate jokes at all if you do ring in with scurvy. Do you know how that happened, by the way? Oh, I'm going to have forgotten now. I'll tell you what it is. Is it Sicily? When they discovered, it was an English doctor who discovered that having some lemon juice on a long voyage stopped stopped sailors getting scurvy. And because Sicily, this is fascinating. I don't know whether it's gospel or whether it's a theory, but it was an English doctor, probably a ship's doctor to start with, who experimented, which meant that there'd be one voyage where some of the sailors were getting preserved lemon, presumably, and some of the sailors weren't, because you need a control, don't you, to test whether it's working. And using that, which I think is epidemiology, is it? Anyway, using that, he established that the sailors who had lemon on a long voyage didn't get scurvy, and the sailors who hadn't had it did. And at that point, Sicily was like the fruit bowl of southern Europe. Lemons were growing there like they were going out of fashion. And overnight, Sicily's economy was completely transformed, because everybody wanted lemons. Every ship needed barrel loads of lemons to make sure that none of the sailors got scurvy. And there is quite a strong theory that the mafia had its roots in that financial explosion of supplying lemons to the various European navies. They just muscled in on the action really quickly, or even that's where the seeds of the mafia were sown, which I just find that kind of stuff fascinating. 10:37 is the time. Richard is in Birmingham. Richard, what would you like to say?
Oh, James.
Hello, mate. What's on your mind? Well, that's two. That's twice we've tried with Richard. Is he yanking my chain in some way, or just a bad phone? Sorry, mate. I don't know what's going on there. Claire's in Wimbledon. Claire, what would you like to say?
Hiya. I was just going to say, if you're working to a budget and you have children, obviously what this conversation is mainly focusing on. For example, the other day the kids wanted to make chilli for dinner, and we went to our local supermarket. I won't say the name.
Why not?
Oh, okay, the Sainsbury's.
Oh, you can't say the name. You can't say the name.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm teasing you. Go on, carry on.
Okay. We got all the ingredients in the basket and everything like that, and it came to, I think it was about just under 11 quid. All right? That'll feed us, and it probably does 2 nights, which is good. And
so what you got? You've got some mince, you've got a tin of beans, tin of tomatoes.
Some mushrooms. But I know people are going to be shouting, going, "You don't put that in chilli."
You can if you want. Don't just ignore the haters, Claire.
Oh, I see. But you know, just fresh veg and things like that. And you've got some
you need
rice,
an onion, don't
oil,
you? Need an onion. You need some. Yeah, and you've got probably. Did you buy rice as well, or did you have that at home already?
Rice as well. Rice as well.
Okay, I got it.
I think we got it. I think we got it down. I think we got it to about 11. Yeah. 12 quid. Say 12 quid, right?
Fair enough.
Anyway, as we were walking past, all of a sudden the idea of a chilli went out the window, because the kids saw £5 deal, 2 pizzas and a tub of Haagen-Dazs ice cream.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Ben and Jerry's ice cream.
Oh, thanks for clearing that up.
Sorry, I know, just in case people were wondering. And all of a sudden, it was like, oh, can we have that instead, please, please?
Really? And had they been quite looking forward to making chili or not prior to that?
Yeah, they love it. They normally love it. And the thing is that I'll tell you a story. It's actually a running joke in this house because when we get to the end of the month, because the money's running a bit dry after bills and stuff, my son said, great, it's skint week. So it means we get all the good food.
Oh, really?
So he goes, oh, great, we get chicken nuggets and we get pizzas.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. They're good food from his point of view, all the junky food, as it were, the cheap
what
stuff.
I'm saying is, when you've got people who are struggling on a budget and possibly can't afford all the fresh fruit and veg and things like that, and I know people say you can use frozen stuff, blah, 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 blah. But if you do have deals like that...
They can't walk past it, can they? They're not going to...
Not for a £5. I mean, the tub of ice cream alone was... I know it sounds stupid, but nearly £4.
Yeah, of course.
So you get 2 pizzas and that for a £5, and people go, well, that's good.
The pizzas aren't necessarily unhealthy.
No, I suppose not.
Do you know that when you made that noise, my producer pulled exactly the same face that noise would go alongside?
If you ate pizza every day, the cheese and tomato pizza every day, because that's all you could afford to feed your children.
Yeah, well, that's what I was wondering about. That's what I was wondering about at the top of the hour.
I don't know, for example, salad or vegetable with it. How is that healthy? They're not getting the nutrients. They're not getting anything. But if all you can afford...
Did you buckle? Did you put all the mince back and just buy the pizzas?
No.
Oh, good.
But I did the next day.
Yeah, no, well, you would, wouldn't you?
I did the next day because fine. Because my budget had run down because an unexpected bill gone out, and I was like, oh, well, I better go and get the pizza and the ice cream then.
No, I think you've absolutely nailed it, Claire. That's exactly how it works. But, of course, you're in the position of being able to do one on one day and the next on the other. But as you established, if you were just looking at the deal every day, then it would be a variation on the pizza. Maybe not with the ice cream, but a variation on the pizza. For almost every meal. Thank you. I love that. It's skimp week. We get all the good stuff. 10:41 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Loads of people texting me about limes and limeys now. I sometimes think I'm going to stop sharing my little nuggets of interest with you. You start getting all pedantic about it and picking me up and picking holes. The origin of limey probably has links with the naval practice of getting some vitamin C into your bones, into your body as well. But the stuff about Sicily and the mafia was today's anecdote. That was today's story. You don't need to bring limeys and limes into it. 10:41 is the time. Philip is in Leeds. Philip, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Big fan of your show.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, I just thought I'd give you a bit of an insight, really, into my story with my dad. Yeah. He's 70 now, just turned 70. When he was 53, he was diagnosed with bowel cancer. It had spread to his rectum, it had spread to his liver. He was given a 10% chance of survival. Yeah. And fortunately, it came through. At the time he was diagnosed, his health, it was great. And at the time when he was diagnosed, we was told, that his health wasn't great. I mean, he was a little bit overweight, but it wasn't too bad. So after that, he'd been through a bit of personal problems. He split up with my mum and things, and our relationships after that weren't great. But after that, and he came through the cancer, we all thought, right, it's going to turn his life around. He's going to lead a healthier life. He's got a second chance out of nowhere, really. Yeah. So we just kind of thought, right, this is another chance for him. I tried to encourage him to be healthy. I took him out golfing all the time and got him now for meals at my house. In the 17 years since his diagnosis, he's basically gone downhill rapidly. All he does is eat junk food. All he does is used to spend about £400 a month on cigarettes, so it's nothing to do with money. Right. He just orders takeaways all the time. He doesn't cook for himself.
Oh, this causes you pain, doesn't it, Philip?
Oh, massively, yeah. I mean, it's hugely frustrating to me and my brother. We've tried to help. But it just kind of gives you a bit of another side of it, that people are there.
So you can be malnourished, I suppose, and overweight, can't you? We think of it as people wasting away, but you could be desperately unhealthy while not going hungry.
This is it. And basically, he's now been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in the last month. Dear. Because of the continued poor eating, because of his choices.
What does he say when you and your brother pick him up on it? What does he say? Does he say, leave me alone, I'm a grown-up?
Essentially, yeah. He's almost at the point of, well, there's nothing I can do now, but he's been saying that for 10 years.
That's sad. Whereas you're thinking we could have another few years with your dad if you sorted yourself out.
Yeah, this is it. And you see, I mean, to his credit, I've been banging on at him to stop smoking. And he's gone on to vaping now because we're spending so much on cigarettes, and he's now saving a fortune by vaping.
Yeah, that's progress.
It's a tiny bit of progress, yeah. But yeah, I just think there's more to it than, he's got the money. He's got the monte to do this. There's probably people
there's more to it than poverty.
There is.
You're definitely right. You're a good lad as well, Philip. You're a good son. It's nice. You're the concern. We often think of it being the other way around, don't we? It's the parents that are supposed to be looking out for the children, but the pendulum swings, and you're now going. You've got a sort of superannuated adolescent on your hands who doesn't want to do what he's told, doesn't want to do.
Exactly.
Do what's good for him.
But to give you another quick one on the vitamin D as well. My partner has multiple sclerosis.
Oof.
And she has, it's called relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which is the lightest version of it.
Okay.
She was diagnosed about 13 years ago.
Right.
And found that there's actually a link
to vitamin D.
To vitamin D, yeah. There's a link to vitamin D deficiency. And essentially, she started taking very high doses of vitamin D. And now she has no problems with multiple sclerosis at all.
Really? She's a lot more mobile. Well, completely.
Yes.
I mean, that it does fit, doesn't it, with joints and bones and overall health. I think you're right. If only you could get it through to your dad, what a difference it makes to be consuming more healthily. Thank you, Philip, mate. Take care. 10:45 is the time. 10:49 is the time. And I just looked it up, actually, because the reason why Americans referred to British sailors as limeys was apparently because of the citrus fruit that would be aboard. But we've all read I casi di Malaspina e la mafia delle campagne di Palermo, haven't we? We all read that. The cases of Malaspina and the mafia in the campaigns of Palermo. One of the early accounts of how the rocketing demand for lemons actually gave rise to the financial environment in which the mafia was able to flourish. Citrus farmers resorted to hiring private security providers to protect themselves from theft and to arrange intermediaries between the retailers and the exporters. So you'd be going back to sort of the end of the around about early to mid 19th century. And it was, I think, a Scottish Dr. James Lind. There it is, James Lind, the man who helped to cure scurvy. I got it exactly right. So you can all get lost with your limey business. That's also true, but it's not a challenge or a repudiation of the tale of James Lind discovering that scurvy could be kept off sailors by lemons, by citrus, by vitamin C, and then the explosion in the lemon market coming out of Sicily created the economic conditions in which the mafia could thrive. You live and learn. I tell you what, you always learn something on this programme, don't you, whether you want to or not. Hayley's in Lancaster. Hayley, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Well, every day is a school day with you. And that's why
isn't it just? Thank you.
I love it. I just wanted to offer a sort of slightly different perspective, which is that the fruit and there's loads and loads of evidence that's out there, both in scientific papers, but also in popular science as well, that's demonstrating that actually the amount of nutrients we are getting from our fruit and vegetables now is much less than it would have been 20, 30, 40 years ago and more, because of intensive farming. The nutrients that we get from our fruit and veg kind of come from the soil, right? And
well, of course, I suppose.
Yeah, and because of intensive farming, that soil isn't getting a chance to replenish. This is both in terms of what we grow here and also what we import as well. So, here we are trying to obviously buy fruit and veg and feed ourselves, thinking that we're fulfilling our nutritional needs from that fruit and veg. But actually, what we have to do now is eat more than we needed to in the past to get the same levels of things like vitamin C, vitamin D, riboflavin.
Don't take this the wrong way, but I thought I'd just double check what you were saying while you were speaking. And it's National Geographic have got a brilliant story from May of last year about the mounting evidence that shows many of today what they call whole foods, as in processed foods and are just not packed with the vitamins and nutrients on anything like the level that they were 70 years ago. And it is a major contributor to malnourishment.
Yeah. So, but that means that even with the best will in the world, it's not. And obviously, this is going to affect ultimately the people with the least money the most, because they're because that's
buying the cheapest stuff.
Exactly.
Do you grow anything of your own up there?
Me? Yeah. I just live in a little flat, but I have grown from time to time. Yeah,
I suppose that's probably. I mean, the more you grow, the better. But it's quite labour intensive, isn't it? It can be quite.
Well, it is, and you don't, if you're just like one person, I can, get a handful of courgettes and a few tomatoes. That's not going to see me through a year, is it?
No, but it's better than not. I guess it's better than not. So 38% decline in riboflavin, which calcium in broccoli, kale, and mustard greens dropped. Calcium would be relevant for bone health. The iron content in charred cucumbers and turnip greens has taken a big hit, and asparagus. And turnip has lost considerable amounts of vitamin C in collard greens, mustard greens and turnip greens. So you're bang on, Hayley. How do you know about that? What's your area of reason for your interest?
I've through my work in the past, I've been, it's sort of touched on things like food security,
fair enough,
nutritional security. So it's come through that, and also I really love eating.
Yes.
So yeah.
That's a lovely piece by Nigella in one of the papers today. I think it's the Times when she talks about how she only likes cooking for eaters. And I completely understand what she means. There's nothing worse than if you're entertaining than someone. I don't mean food intolerances or vegetarians. I just mean people who don't really enjoy food. You've spent 3 hours slaving away in the kitchen, and then someone sits down for dinner who just sort of pushes it around the plate a bit. I'm with Nigella on that, although I'm willing to concede she's probably a slightly better cook than me. 10:54 is the time. Neil, thank you, Hayley. Take care. Neil's in Weston-super-Mare. Neil, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. I'm a great fan.
Thank you. You don't have to say
all the time.
You don't have to say that, but it's very kind of you.
Thank you. I run a social care company, and we have found, over the recent years, a massive increase in people with addiction services and learning difficulties having vitamin deficiencies in various issues because of what we put down to support packages are being cut over time, so they're not getting necessarily the same support around being able to go shopping, being able to understand nutritional needs.
I remember speaking to a care leaver a few years ago who had no means of preparing food in their accommodation. And so what are you going to do? You're going to have a bag of chips twice a day. You've got nothing in your pocket.
I see it all the time, and especially with care leavers, where they, associate naturally made food, as dirty, and only see food that's in boxes and packaging that are, is the only clean type of food.
Yes. What can you do about it? How can you help?
Vote differently.
No, I mean in your day job when you're going into.
Well, it's perseverance when it comes down to it. It's perseverance with young people. It's leading by example. It's trying to use enthusiasm, different techniques, a way of trying to actually speak to people and get them enthused in seeing the fact that a bag full of multicoloured food is much better than a bag full of grey food.
That's really interesting, isn't it?
And it really hurts us. Because we see it all the time, and when you see people taking hours away and taking packages of support away from people, and you're seeing the effects of people basically dying early or dying.
Oh, of course it is. Well, there's a story last month about children being shorter than they used to be. So it's kicking in everywhere, isn't it? And yet, it doesn't have anything like the sort of sense of urgency that you might expect it to.
No, and it's all about blaming the individual rather than actually thinking about that we've got a collective, responsibility around this. This is a societal problem as well as a governmental problem.
And mental health. I'm a great believer. If I had my time again, I think I'd study that. I'm absolutely fascinated by the relationship between gut health and overall health, but gut health and mental health in particular. I think that's probably the next massive frontier of
yeah,
scientific discovery and education breakthrough. If you could, well, even just not being hungry, teachers will tell you that's why they've got breakfast clubs. The difference between a classroom of children who've had a decent breakfast and a classroom of children that haven't is absolutely immeasurable. It's a completely different proposition.
Definitely, and that's things. I mean, myself, I've struggled with weight and things, and a lot of those issues have come from my relationship with food, and I can see that in young people. That's why I use my own story as a way of sort of influencing them.
Because it's nice to feel full, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
that's the bottom line.
And culturally, that we show love with food.
Yes, exactly that, and that's why I always think of those mothers poking food through the chain link fence when Jamie Oliver was in the school canteen trying to wean them all off turkey Twizzlers, and it was an act of love by those mothers. People missed that at the time. There was quite a lot of middle class sneering, but it was wrong to sneer, just as it was wrong to try and undermine Jamie's attempts to improve the diet and therefore lengthen the lives of the children that he was dealing with at the time. Thank you, Neil. I'd like that. Max does a lot of foraging. I haven't got the guts to forage, mate. I wouldn't trust myself. Seriously. I'd be worried about magic mushrooms or something like that, or accidentally eating something poisonous. But if you know what you're doing... I saw a bloke in Norfolk by the sea wall, and it was like a crop of I could only really describe it as wild spinach, and he was filling carrier bags with it. I said, what do you do with that? He goes, I sell it. He sells it to one of the local pubs, and I think they do a soup with it, and it was really, you thought, that's got to be delicious, hasn't it, with all the salt water and the air. And he just knew exactly. He says, well, I said, there are a lot of spots. He goes, yeah, but we keep them quite secret. There's a few of us that do this. And Samphire is another one. There's good spots to go to. But I don't know. Maybe when I retire, I'll get into foraging. I'll get into getting into hunter-gathering my own... I won't, will I? That's never going to happen. I used to put... Now I'd say I'm never going to write a book. 2 minutes after 11 is the time. You can tell when a topic is going to be a little bit touchy when you're not actually talking about it yet, but you mention that you're going to be talking about it later, and you spend the first 5 minutes of the programme getting more calls about the things you've said you're going to be talking about later than you did about the thing that you said you're going to be talking about now. Are you still with me at the back? Because the conversation about landlords facing losses now, some 225,000 private landlords will be left running losses on their rental properties, is... obviously something that is worth talking about. But the idea that we should be cracking open the violins and expressing sympathy for landlords is something that can be quite provocative for many people listening. And I completely understand that. The point is there are some good landlords and there are some bad landlords. There are some greedy landlords and there are some quite altruistic landlords. And I use that word advisedly. I know of what I speak. I've had bad landlords and good landlords in my time. Some will rinse you for every last penny that they can. Some agencies actually probably worse than individuals, but you're complicit as a landlord in the shark-like proclivities of the agency that you employ, and similarly, others will be conscious of not wanting to price their tenants out of the property because they quite like they may even like the people, they may like the human beings involved, but also the security of having a tenant you can trust and who you like. So here's the numbers. The average 2-year buy-to-let mortgage rate reached 6.69% on Friday. 6.69%. Now that has gone up, presumably from between 1.5% and 2% for a buy-to-let, which is going to be a little bit higher than a live, but buy-to-live. So that's astonishing. Any other investment where your overheads came close to quadrupling overnight, and one of your major overheads, and that is the interest payments, or the mortgage payments, came close to quadrupling overnight, is going to be pretty serious. So the most highly leveraged landlords are most at risk. And we will do something on is it a moral dimension? I think we will. We'll do something on the moral dimension here. But we'll also, I think, spend some time looking at the actual practicalities of this issue, the actual logistical, if that's the right word to use, impact, repercussions, ramification. That's a good word. There you go. I got there in the end. The logistical ramifications. Got all their albums. So what actually happened? And it means that we are going to invite landlords to ring in, and we're going to avoid the lazy stereotyping. I do subscribe very much to the school of thought that one of the main reasons why lots and lots of people who are younger than me, well, I was about to say can't buy a house. One of the reasons why they can't buy a house is that they are buying a house for somebody else. That is the bottom line. It changed in the course of my lifetime. The legislation for buy-to-let must have been made much easier. And in a way, that's a democratic move, because previously, the Duke of Westminster might own half of London and the Crown Estate owns the other half. So the idea that ordinary people could muscle in on the landlord business, you could argue, it had a democratizing effect. But of course, what it also did was left legions of young people who are now not young anymore, but still on the property ladder, essentially being penalised for not having capital, for not having a deposit. So we bought our house, it's so easy to remember because I bought it in the year 2000. So it was 23 years ago. And I've told you this before, we got a 110% mortgage. So that was almost the cut-off point. 23 years ago, 110% mortgage. That was the last time it was easy to buy property on a modest income with no capital, with no deposit. So there is no point me drawing on my experiences in any way when talking to you about the current climate. I know some people really struggle to understand this, and I'm not exactly overcome with patience for these people because it's an almost willful ignorance. I could still right now take calls from people telling me about what happened to them in the 1960s or the 1970s. And they'd say, well, we did this and we did that, and my husband worked 2 jobs. And you're just like, this bears no resemblance. I don't understand how people can be so willfully daft on something that is so easily rectified. Just look at for example, the multiple. Look at the difference between average income and average house price, and then come back to me and tell me how easy it is to buy a house in 1954. It's just silly. It's a silly conversation that distracts from reality and encourages absence of sympathy for the plight, the very real plight of people who wanted to own property but can't. So that's why I think there is an element of, I'm going to say selfishness. I would perhaps prefer a different word, a slightly less loaded word. There is an element of selfishness in the army of investors who realised that buy-to-let would be a fantastic way of subsidising their old age or subsidising their income, and the consequence of that, although not desirable to you, was the fact that you turned the property market into a place that became almost impregnable for younger people who were earning enough to pay your mortgage but didn't have enough capital, but couldn't save enough to pull together a deposit and get onto the property ladder themselves. So that is the backdrop of my personal position on this. But as I get older, I become mellower, and the idea of casting all landlords as some sort of Rackman-style figure who's trying to kebab his tenants and rinse them of that's just silly. There are some terrible landlords, there are some wonderful landlords. But I do think it's important to get that backdrop in place. The explosion of the buy-to-let market must, unless I am missing something huge, in which case you'll tell me very quickly, it must be a major driver of the difficulties people have first-time buyers getting into the property market. So that's the background to this. If hundreds of thousands of landlords are overnight going to move into a loss-making scenario, what is that going to mean? Okay? And I want this question to be answered by landlords and tenants, because it will already be happening to people. This is the 225,000 who are refinancing now. Some people will have been refinancing previously. The post-trust period, if you like, where these numbers have been terrifying, is already going to have impacted. So are people being chucked out of their homes because the landlord needs to sell the alternative is to run a loss every month. Nobody went into landlording to be running a loss every month. Even if you're breaking even, it's worth doing because the value of the property historically has gone up. Property values are now, or in the last year, I think they've gone down for the first time in living memory. And so even that doesn't work anymore. You're not even going to suck up a minor loss in the knowledge that the asset is increasing in value. So all of this I understand, all of this logic I understand. But what is going to be, what will the impact be, very simply, of these refinancing deals, of the fact that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of landlords are going to be moving or have already moved overnight from making a modest profit every month to making a loss? What is that going to mean for the broader market, for society, but of course more pertinently for you? What's it going to mean for you? And if you want to make a case for landlords needing more help, then you are welcome to, but you will be, I'm afraid, speaking into an, at this point, somewhat sceptical ear. Because if it's a choice between helping people who don't own a property and rent it out to other people and helping people who do own a property and rent it out to somebody else, I am going to, at this point in the conversation, I'm going to be leaning towards the former category as opposed to the latter. Let me find a couple of examples. Tim's in Highgate. I have no sympathy for landlords. If they are unable to profit any further from my inability to buy a house, they can sell up and get back all the money I've spent on their mortgage, plus profit from the increase in the property's value. I think that is evidence-based, but, you know, I don't want to make it too simplistic. Dave says, I entirely agree with you. On landlords, part of the problem is that housing is now a financial asset and not a basic right. People can make a living by being able to take one or more mortgages and getting someone else to pay on their behalf. Capital would be better invested in small businesses, but the value in housing makes this a non-starter. You see, Dave, you think you're agreeing with me, but Linda heard exactly the same conversation and says, I've never agreed with it, James. Never agreed with it. Never will. That's me. It's pure and simple greed. And I'm assuming, says Rick, it's only a loss-making scenario when landlords have taken out interest-only mortgages. Even if property prices stay stagnant, the tenant is still largely paying for it. The worst case is that the landlord subsidises the asset purchase. I think I just covered that. You must have been composing your text, Rick, as I was discussing it. So, obviously the moral dimension is going to kick in, and good. I like conversations with the moral dimension, but in the next hour we're probably going to talk about private schools, and that is going to be an almost entirely moral dimension conversation. So on this one I am leaning a little bit to the practicalities of it, to the sort of realities on the ground. If you want to join in, the number you need is 0345 6060 973. What is it going to mean? And if you want to play the game, then why should we feel sorry for you? And I mean that sincerely. I think you could quite easily make a case for deserving our sympathy. That would be a fairly straightforward way, perhaps, of approaching it. Because if you're not in this business, then you're not going to know the realities of it. And in the interest of full disclosure, I was briefly, not even that briefly actually. I was a landlord for a while, largely by accident, because we were desperate to buy the house that we used to live in and hadn't sold the house that we were living in, and somehow the mortgage people, we worked it all out that we could rent it out via a social housing company and move and have enough to pay the mortgage on the new house. I won't be doing that again. It wasn't suited to my temperament. I didn't enjoy having the responsibility for the property. But, you know, maybe if we'd been a little bit more grown up about it and a little bit more sensible, then I'd be sitting here now with a massive asset and an income behind me that I don't currently have. So you're perfectly capable of conceiving that as a more fool me scenario. I'll hit the phones shortly, but first, Pete's in Manchester. He says, how many people are going to get your reference to a Rachman-style figure? Well, I don't want the back in the day alarm to go off. But I think, is Rachman not still widely regarded as the sort of pantomime villain? Well, not even a pantomime villain. The villain of landlordy, buying up huge swathes of Notting Hill by using some very dodgy practices. Maybe I am showing my age. But Pete, it says, my mum knew Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis and went to parties with them in London. She always used to mention Rachman in her stories. Well, I'm glad that I've given you a little reminder of your mum, Pete. Mission accomplished this morning. 17 minutes after 11, and we're having a look at landlords. 225,000 of them facing losses as refinancing costs jump. I'm not seeing much sympathy yet, but there is time and room. But I think, for now, more interested in what that's going to mean, what the impacts of those facts will be. Anna is in Pontypridd. Anna, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. So, for us, we're landlords in Pontypridd. However, we're originally from London. We couldn't afford to buy in London. So we thought, okay, well, where can we actually afford?
Right.
And so we've been caused by the problem. We couldn't afford to live where we wanted to, and we've moved away from everyone to Pontypridd. We now have rentals, and we've got a few, like a networking of landlords, and I'm quite worried. Basically, I don't understand where everyone's going to live, but they created the perfect storm where people are just going to sell up because they can't afford due to the mortgages, and then no one can buy because the mortgages are too high on interest. And then
hang on, because you've already highlighted an even bigger problem than the one you rang in to highlight. Because if no one can buy, then you're not going to be able to sell.
Well, yeah. So everyone's stuck, and then the legislation's changed, so people are selling because of that, or they change into holiday lets. So I can't understand where everyone's going to rent because the council aren't building it as much. What
position are you in at the moment? Have you've got people in your property, have you?
We're really lucky. We started late, so we saw what was happening and managed to do it. So we've got a few holiday lets and a few HMOs, which we think what was being needed because there'll be some people.
I'm not here to interrogate you, but there'll be some people wondering how you could not afford to buy a place in London, but you could afford to buy several properties in South Wales.
A 5-bed house in Pontypridd is 85,000, whereas a 1-bed flat.
No, you've answered my question. You've answered my question.
470.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I now don't live with friends or family, but I can afford 4 houses. So it's like, what do you want to choose? Do you want to be lonely, but actually be able to afford to live, or do you want to live but struggle and never be able to see your kids?
No, I mean, they're third options, I suppose, but no, it wouldn't be fair to start holding your feet to the fire about that.
No, but yeah, it is bad what we're doing, but...
it's not bad. It works for you. And your tenants, presumably, particularly in the HMOs, your tenants wouldn't be in a position to buy their own property anyway, so you're providing an essential service. And are you... are you in a position where some of those mortgages are going to be moving into loss-making territory?
No, we managed to, and only one of them is at a rate of like 6.4
already.
6.4,
and you can sustain that.
But we can, because it's a holiday that it works for us.
Yeah.
And
okay.
So we've managed to make sure it would work with really high rates, but it really obviously just not making as much as we wanted to. But fair enough, it still pays for itself.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is other landlords in less felicitous positions than you. If you move into the red, then you're going to sell, but who's going to buy it?
Yeah, pretty much.
And that's the question, isn't it?
But then you also see and hear about all the banks and the big, like Sainsbury's and MS, going into being landlords because it is perfect for them.
Yeah. Maybe, but I don't know that they do. But we haven't used the R word yet, but it's hard to see how repossessions don't come into the picture at some point on this. If the landlord can't afford to pay the mortgage, or the rent becomes so high that they can't find anyone to move in, and that's what I mean by ramifications. So you've helped to clarify the question, Anna, but the answers are what we need. Is what is actually going to happen? You've got someone who can't afford to carry on buying the house that somebody else is living in, is renting. And what does the pulling of the plug or the falling of the axe, what does it actually look like and in real terms for people living through this? Thank you, Anna. Take care. John's also in Wales, in Swansea. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Sorry,
John.
a bit nervous about this because it's a contentious subject. I am a landlord. I've been a landlord for a decade. I'd like to think that I did it I've become a landlord for positive reasons, to try and help and try and support my tenants. And I know that's not a commonly held belief that that's what landlords do, but from the heart, that's what I try to do.
Yes, fair enough.
My lived experience in this is that pre-2008, tenants or my current tenants would have been able to get a mortgage. Post-2008, they were no longer able to get mortgages.
Yeah.
Some people had the means by which to acquire these properties and house the people who now couldn't get mortgages. My view is that is a decision of the financial institutions, and the financial institutions are going to have to make a decision your previous caller touched upon it. The number of landlords that I know and I work with and are highly leveraged and are unable to stomach some of these costs are selling up. I do a lot of research into the property industry and do work for mortgage companies and for local authorities. One of the most stark figures that I've seen since the start of this year, the number of tenanted properties for sale across all three portals, all three major property portals, has gone up 150%.
So this is, I would buy it. I would buy the place and inherit the tenants. Is that what you're talking about?
That's what most landlords are trying to do, but these properties aren't selling. So we've got this stagnation problem. The major worry for me as a landlord, and I see all around me where my properties are, is those landlords that are staying in the market are putting their rents up exceptionally fast and really high. The current rent inflation in the UK is running at 13.8% and rising, and it was already high before. So, for those of us who want to, I mean, I don't want to put my rent up to my tenants, but you've got what most of your listeners must understand is the amount of cost that's been loaded into the system over the past sort of 10 years. It doesn't get borne by the businesses that rent these properties out. And frankly, a landlord is a business. It gets borne by the end consumer. In the same way that food inflation, it's the end consumer that ends up paying for it. Unfortunately, and I don't want this to happen, but unfortunately, with the cost being loaded in, that is going to only have one effect. That's going to have an effect on the end person. So I feel terribly sorry for my tenants. Many of my tenants, as I was saying to your colleague a moment ago, many of them shouldn't be in rented accommodation. They should be able to get mortgages and they should be able to own their own home. And some of them probably aren't going to be able to own their own home because of their financial situations and their decisions that they've made in life. Surely someone should house them. As a nation, I think we've got to make it.
So the shortage of social housing is always going to be a key part of these conversations as well. And then the difficulty of getting credit. I'm not 100% clear on what you're telling me though. What? I mean, let me read you this. Okay, so this is from Dave in Bristol. Imagine I took out a loan, bought shares, relied on the profits from shares to pay back the loan. A few years down the line, I get upset that I can't pay off the loan because the market's changed and the income no longer covers the loan. You wouldn't get much sympathy, so why should you get it if instead of buying shares you bought a house, especially buy-to-let?
There shouldn't be any sympathy. Okay. The sympathy should be for the tenant. James.
Well, what's going to happen to them? This is what I mean by not being quite clear. What do you think is going to happen if, for example, every single property you have was currently on, 1.8, and then come midnight tonight, like Cinderella, they all hit 6.69? What actually happens?
What actually happens is, for me, fortunately, a lot of my mortgages are on fixed terms, so that's not going to be instantly hitting my tenants overnight. But I now
I'm giving you a theoretical scenario in which they all change at midnight tonight. They all go to 6.69 at midnight tonight. What happens?
How the market response, costs go up. Same as fuel, same as food.
No, to you. What happens to you and your tenants if they all become unsustainable? You're now making a loss on every property you own. What happens? What do you do? What do you do?
What do I do? What I would do is I would try and put my margin to the absolute minimum possible, and to basically to
weather the storm. So you'd try and hold on to the properties.
I mean, you could sell them, but you're not going to sell a property with a tenant in situ.
That's what I mean. That's why I'm not trying to trip you up or anything like that. I'm genuinely baffled about what happens in these situations, because there's 225,000 landlords who are going to face the scenario I've just described to you, and I'm trying to work out what's going to happen.
I can tell you what's already happening. I own a research company that researches this very topic. I'm going to a meeting. I'm actually on the M4 going to a meeting to talk about this. Like, what's happening right now is many landlords are putting their properties on the market and trying to sell them.
Yes,
they are not selling.
Right.
So that is not going to cause that's not going to cause a crash in the housing market, because that quantity, 5,000. Listings out of hundreds of thousands of listings, where it's a very small part of the market.
Okay.
So it's not going to cause not going to cause prices to fall, but it's in essence, James, it's going to cause homelessness. Tenants will end up getting evicted because the landlords want to sell the properties. When they're evicted, they've got to go somewhere. Where are they going to go? There's no new landlords coming into the market.
No one's going to be moving into the market now, and the only people who are going to be buying the properties are going to be people who want to live in them.
Exactly. And James, the most important thing in all this, the only solution to this problem, and this is coming from a landlord, is the government must start immediately building social housing. It has to be done alongside affordable homes for people to buy. We need both. There's always a place for the private landlord, but there's definitely going to be a shortage of what's going forward. There's already a massive shortage of social.
No, it's good to hear you say that, John. Thank you. You clearly know your stuff. Thank you for helping me come to a better understanding, albeit bleak, the road ahead. But I can't personally see it much alternative. It's just a question of how big the problem will be, not necessarily what the problem actually is. But social housing, social capital, it's so simplistic sometimes, or simple sometimes, that you think perhaps it's simplistic. It seems like such a no-brainer. It's infrastructure, it's asset, it creates jobs, it creates growth, and it creates homes for people, affordable homes for people who can't currently live in them. And I don't know whether was there stigma. Maybe we should have this conversation. It's one that is relevant to age. There was not much stigma to it when I was growing up. There wasn't any stigma to it at all. There was no sort of sense of... it's probably the Thatcher thing, is it? If you hadn't bought your council house, then there was something wrong with you, or you hadn't availed yourself of the opportunity to buy it. I always remember Bob Crow, former head of the RMT, who still lived in a council house, and right-wing journalists used to queue up to somehow try and attack him for it, or suggest he'd got no business being in it, because obviously later in his career he ended up earning a very, very good whack as General Secretary of the RMT. But he just used to explain that's not what social housing is. It's not like a safety net for people. It's social capital that improves society and gives choices to people. So you can either... I guess under my glorious rule, that would be top of the list. Build. But that's when I start worrying that it's so obvious and so straightforward that there's probably something that I'm missing. It's coming up to 11:30. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines. 33 minutes after 11, you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So a couple of stories that we won't be doing as phone-in topics, but which are quite interesting and very interesting. Johnson's still not given his phone to the inquiry. Did you see that? Remember, there was a big sort of hoo-ha, wasn't there? A big toing and froing about how Downing Street didn't want it to be given, and he said he'd give it, and well, he hasn't. And it just occurs to me again that a bit like Farage in the bank the other day, remember when he said that he'd had his bank account shut down and he couldn't open one, and then a few days later it emerged that the bank that had closed his account had offered him one days before he started whining to everyone that would listen about how hard it was to open a bank account. I don't think we're ever going to stop taking these people at face value. It doesn't matter, does it? It's as if the boy who cried wolf is always believed, and there's never a wolf. That's where we are now with people like Johnson and Farage and Trump, I suppose, if you're listening in America. It never breaks, so it doesn't work. Is it a proverb, the boy who cried wolf? What is it, a folk tale? It doesn't work. You never stop believing. I don't know why. So Johnson and his phone, his spokespeople are claiming that he's still taking advice on how to open it safely. I mean, you just sit there and you sort of think, and the problem is, journalistically, he might tell the truth once, and if you've gone all in on accusing him of lying on the one occasion that he tells the truth, then you're going to get lynched for it, even though 99.999% of the time that you've called him a liar, he was a liar, and everyone who sucks up to him ignores it. It's just bizarre. So you've got this strange scenario now where he's not handed over his phone. The deadline was 4:00 yesterday, and we have to accept his version of events, that it is such a complicated security matter that he's still taking advice on how he's going to be able to turn his phone on safely, which is, I mean, I would have thought cobblers. It's a Faraday cage, isn't it, if nothing else? And also, what would the security risk be? Since when did a man who went partying with a KGB spy after getting rid of his own security start worrying about security risks posed by his WhatsApp on an old phone? It is so bizarre. And we sit here contemplating this stuff, And I don't think we ever tire of telling the truth or trying to get to the truth. But, I mean, geez, the idea that people would look at Farage whining about something and just think that must be true. This is a bloke who lied about an assassination attempt. When the wheel fell off his car and he claimed the mechanic had told him that it was an assassination attempt. So we tracked down the mechanic and he said, no, absolute nonsense. And now he comes out and starts saying, they've shut my bank account. And then the bank comes out and says, yeah, we shut it because you haven't got enough money. And now we also offered you one with our bank account for normal people. And Johnson talking about his phone. And the Privileges Committee, Daily Mail report it today like this. Boris allies off hook over criticism of Partygate Kangaroo Court. When, in fact, the story is that the Commons Privileges Committee's report into Boris Johnson's cronies essentially committing contempt was waved through by Parliament. It didn't even go to a vote. But the amendment that would have seen them properly sanctioned for it was not selected by the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle. So they're not going to face possible punishment similar to what Boris Johnson himself faced. But an unamended motion has been passed, making clear how people should behave when a Privileges Committee inquiry is taking place. And I'll give you a clue. Rees-Mogg and Dorries and the rest of them did not behave in a way that MPs should behave when a Privileges Committee investigation is taking place. It's a funny one, isn't it? 11:37 is the time. Heather is in Broxburn. Back to the landlords, Heather. What would you like to say? The more I do, the big inflated introduction, the more...
Yeah, similar to your previous call. I'm worried where all the people...
We're having problems with our phones today. I can only apologise. It's certainly not Heather's fault, and it's not the fault of any of my colleagues, but the temptation to lose patience must be resisted at all costs. Technology can defeat us all. Let's see if Nick in Liverpool has any more luck. Nick, what would you like to say?
Oh, morning, James. Long time listener, first time caller. Always wanted to say that.
Welcome aboard. What can you tell me?
Well, I run a property managing company and I'm a private landlord, and I was a tenant until 5 years ago.
Right, so you've got it covered.
Well, I'm going to cover it from all three angles, I hope. But
yeah.
It's there's three issues at the minute. So I can see 3 email inboxes at the minute, and we've got tens of emails from landlords all telling us, due to interest rate rises, I need to sell the property.
Right.
So we've got an influx of evictions that we need to do, or possession proceedings that we need to do.
Oh, Lord.
And there's 2 main reasons. One is cladding.
Right.
So because of Grenfell Tower and everything that's coming after that, service charges are skyrocketing for leaseholders.
Okay.
But at the same time, Section 24, which is how landlord tax is calculated, means that landlords are getting attacked from those 2 angles. So the only options they have is increase the rents unreasonably.
Why is that happening this week, though, not previously?
Because the interest rate rises.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I can see, but the interest rate rise is the big part of this, the biggest part.
It is, but as it creeps up month by month by month, so the first 6 years, this is becoming a real issue. But also, bear in mind that a lot of people are coming out of their fixed terms now.
Well, that's kind of what we're talking about. That's the focus of the phone-in, is the people who are having to refinance. So of all the people telling you they need to sell, they're almost all going to be refinancing their mortgages and getting slapped around the head with the new interest rate, right?
Indeed, but also the zeitgeist in the media, not necessarily on LBC because it's very balanced, but landlords being the bad guys. So at the same time,
don't take this the wrong way. How much of the last 40 minutes have you listened to?
Most of it.
Okay, because we've covered all of this already.
Okay. Well, another thing I wanted to mention is that not everyone wants to be a landlord.
Yeah, I don't think you've listened to any of it, Nick, have you?
Oh, I do apologise.
That's all right, but I mean, and that's fine, and it's always interesting to but we've covered all of this, and you haven't heard anybody else ringing in, so we're just getting a bit repetitive.
I do apologise. I'll leave you be.
No, it's all right. I mean, good luck to you and stuff like that. But we've covered all of that already. I could just tell immediately that you hadn't listened to any of the phone-in, which means you're unlikely to be able to add to what we've already done. Heather is in Broxburn. Heather, what would you like to say?
Just my concern is really where people are going to go, because I was looking to rent this time last year. So even before all this trust and all that, and we couldn't even get a viewing on a property.
This is what's going to happen to more and more people, right?
Yeah, and we were incredibly lucky that our family were able to support us to get a 100% mortgage. And even more lucky, we got our keys the day before this trust is disastrous.
Yeah.
So we got our mortgage at a decent rate. But just thinking how much we struggled 12 months ago, particularly in a city like Edinburgh that's so tourist-driven, the thing that we think is the main problem is holiday lets are meaning that there's so many properties out of the market.
This is the Airbnb bit. Do you know, every time we touch on these topics, the Airbnb point doesn't get raised until about 3/4 of the way through. And I don't understand why, because as soon as someone raises it, I always find myself thinking, God, yeah, of course, that must be that's the biggest change, really, to most people's relationship with accommodation over the last 10 years. Interest rates, obviously now, absolutely epic. But the biggest change in the availability of property is probably the people who would once have rented it out to tenants and now rent it out to, tens, if not hundreds of people a year, separately.
Yeah, we were actually contacted, we made contact with an Australian broadcasting company who were reaching out about problems getting rents, and we did like a pre-interview about the problem finding property in Edinburgh, because they were looking at it all over the world, because they were looking at it in Sydney and Melbourne and seeing if it was a problem worldwide.
And what was their conclusion? Do you know?
Oh, I think they had to didn't run with the story in the end, because that was the last we heard of it. We did like a pre-interview with a guy. But yeah, it's such a problem worldwide in any big city. Anywhere that anyone might want to go on holiday is going to have a whole different set of problems from the sort of parts of the country where people are not necessarily going to want to make a leisure visit, although there'll still be elements of that wherever you are. So that's got to be on the list as well. I can't see any what would you call it? Any soft landing on this? I mean, it's all again down to the fact that everybody's mortgage comes up at a different time. If it was all coming up at the same time, the rental market would be in absolute peril. Anthony's in Caterham. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I had a brief chat with Andrew Carson about this a few weeks ago, but I suspect you might give me a harder time than he did.
What are you talking about? I'm a pussycat. As long as you've listened to the previous 43 minutes of the programme.
Yes, I have.
Carry on.
I firmly believe that this is an unintended consequence of government policy, because the Conservatives not surprisingly, want as many people to own their own home as possible.
Well, you say do that. I mean, do they though? Do they still?
Yeah, they do. They do.
Sure?
Because you're going to vote. You're more likely to vote Conservative if you've got something to conserve.
Yeah. Okay.
That's how people view it. So if you own your own home, you're definitely more likely to vote Conservative, which is why Margaret Thatcher sold off most of the social housing.
She sold off quite a small proportion of it, I think, in the great scheme of things. But the principle, the theory behind it was certainly tally with what you said.
And that in itself wasn't a bad idea if they'd used the money to replace the houses, but they didn't.
Sure, yeah.
So now they don't want to build. They don't want to build in people's backyards, because if they build houses where they're needed, that will cost them votes, so they don't want to do that. And so what they've done is they came up with a policy that would gradually force landlords to sell, which would decrease the number of people that rented and increase the people that owned their own property. So they did that with Section 24 taxation. So they introduced it over 4 years. So the idea was to do it gradually.
Yes.
And initially, it meant that landlords who were thinking about buying or had just bought with a typical 80% mortgage thought, this isn't viable anymore.
Yes.
We'll knock this
That's
on
not
head.
a bad policy at this point.
I'm not saying.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying it is a bad policy. Then what happened? They're thinking, right, as interest rates gradually creep up, those people with 75% mortgages will have to sell up. From historic lows, don't forget, interest rates at historic lows. Then as they creep up again, the people with 70, 65% mortgages will have to sell up. So then along came the Ukraine war, which no one expected.
Right.
So instead of interest rates gradually creeping up, they soar through the roof, and the government thinking, oh my God, what have we done? But we can't suspend Section 24 tax, which is really what they should do until interest rates come down, because then the headlines in the Daily Mirror will be, landlord
Bless
gives.
you. No one's worried about
get,
headlines in the Daily Mirror, Anthony.
Landlords, well, the Conservatives are, because they're
really
worried
not,
about
mate.
getting re-elected.
They're really not.
So they don't want to be seen to being given landlords a massive tax break. Because
that's not because of headlines that's not because of headlines in the Daily Mirror. That's because of 95% of the population that aren't landlords would think it was grossly unfair.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
It is. But by not doing it, they've forced up rents. And now I've got a portfolio of property which are roughly 50% housing benefit, roughly 50% private. So I can't say to a private tenant whose rent should go up along with the market from 1,100 to 1,600 in some cases.
Yeah, overnight.
I'm putting your rent up 1,600. I say, look, I'm going to have to put it up gradually. I'll put it up to 1,175, and then we'll look at it again in a year. But more worrying than that is that the government are refusing to put up housing benefit. So I've got 3 pensioners in Croydon in one-bedroom flats where the rents now, on a basic one-bed flat, are now 1,200. The market rent is. The government are still only paying 872.
How do they calculate housing benefit rates? Just remind me. It's a while since we've talked about this.
It was originally the 50th percentile.
Yeah.
So the median rent.
Right.
And then to save money, they dropped it to the 30th percentile. It's not even the first percentile now.
We're going to run out of time. I want to pick your brains a bit. Where do your tenants get the rest of the money from at the moment? Is it their savings or?
Well, no. I haven't put their rents up. So I could put them up to 872. They'd end from 872 to 1,200. They'd end up getting evicted.
So you just take the housing benefit
on those particular ones. I'm actually making a loss.
No, I hear you. I thought you would be. And hang on, again, I just. So how does it end? I mean, if it reaches a point, and you're going to struggle, you know you are, to sell the idea that landlords should be getting a tax break, regardless, because people who aren't landlords, but people who aren't landlords who are getting kebabbed on the interest rates aren't getting a tax break.
I can understand.
So it's never going to happen politically or morally. But what happens if you right now couldn't afford to do it anymore? You stick everything on the market and nobody buys it. What happens next?
Well, you'd have to sell at the...
You'd have to keep lowering the price until someone bought it.
Yeah, you would, yeah. And a lot of landlords will have to do that.
Yeah, and it is going to be about numbers. It is literally going to be about how many at every turn. It always is with these conversations. The other thing I have... Anthony, thank you. I sense you have a lot more to say, but I'm already late for this. 11:51 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We spend a lot of time putting the boot into politicians, particularly Conservative politicians, given they've had 13 years to do whatever it was that they could have done instead of all the things they have done. So I just want to take a moment to pay tribute to Laura Farris, a Conservative MP who yesterday took a moment to reflect upon Harriet Harman's chairing of that Privileges Committee and the unconscionable abuse that she received, of course, from people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and I think Nadine Dorries. That Privileges Committee report was endorsed, waved through the House of Commons, approved is the word I'm looking for, approved yesterday, and the judgment that the former Prime Minister's closest sycophants had launched a coordinated attack on its work was also approved. And Laura Farris, who is a Conservative MP, I stress, took a moment to reflect upon what that might have involved for Harriet Harman. And I just thought this was a timely and really helpful reminder of what Parliament can be.
The member for Camberwell and Peckham had already announced her intention to retire from Parliament at the next election, a parliamentary career that has spanned 5 decades and has been defined, probably more than any other person who's ever sat in this House, by her commitment to the advancement of women's rights. 14 weeks before she took up that appointment, her husband of 40 years, Jack, had died. Against this background, I invite members of the House to consider what is more likely, that she agreed to chair the committee as a final act of service to this House, or that she did so because she was interested in pursuing a personal vendetta against Boris Johnson.
That's important, that. It's important, A, to recognise that there are decent people on both sides of the House of Commons, and B, to recognise that politicians like Harriet Harman are possessed of integrity and quality on a scale that everyone can recognise it. It's like it's almost like a glimpse of what the world was like before footballification kicked in, wasn't it? And of course, the footballification in play here isn't party loyalty. It's much sicker than that. It's people like Rhys Morgan-Dorries being just sort of utterly, I don't know, what's the word you'd use to describe their dedication to Boris Johnson? It's just bizarre. It's just grim. And then, of course, over in the House of Lords today, you have a reminder of where we are politically. You know Alf Dubs, Lord Dubs, himself a beneficiary of the Kinder Transport and a tireless campaigner for the rights of refugees. He's been on his feet in the Lords, talking to the Home Office Minister, Lord Simon Murray. I just thought this was worth a little listen as well.
To the Arrival Centre in Dover, which had cartoons and welcoming signs for children, and which were ordered to be removed by the Home Office Minister because it might make the children feel too welcome. Isn't that a disgrace? And isn't it time that government backbenchers felt as embarrassed as we are that this is happening in our country?
The murals that the Noble Lord refers to were provided by our detention contractors and were not commissioned or approved by the Home Office. It's clearly the correct decision that these facilities have the requisite decoration befitting their purpose.
My Lords. My Lords.
There it is, Brexit Britain. 11:55 is the time. Back to Landlords. Jenny's in Wandsworth. Jenny, what would you like to say?
Yes, hello, James. I'm a bit nervous. I'm also angry, but very emotional, because this situation is very close to my heart. I'll tell you about what happened with me.
Go on.
For me, I had a business. Unfortunately, I lost the business around 2019.
Yes.
And then, along with everything I had amazing credit before I had the business, lost the business. I didn't have such good credit anymore.
Okay.
And then I then had to become I had to rely on social housing or making an application for social housing for myself and my two teenage autistic children.
Right.
One with autism and ADHD, the other one with I would say emotional problems, that mental health then.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And I can, thank you, James, and I can say this has been a nightmare for our family. The government should be ashamed of themselves that they have allowed the situation to come to this. I was told that I need to look for private housing. A lot of the landlords, I'm not saying there aren't good landlords out there,
of course,
but a lot of the landlords, they take advantage of the fact of people's unfortunate circumstances, and for them it's just about money, making money. Okay, now the private landlords, they don't want to rent to people like myself, my family, who are relying on universal credit to help pay the rent. Right away, they feel that, you'll damage their property, you won't pay your rent, you this, that, whatever. And a lot of us, we're not in that case, in that situation. We just want a decent, suitable home for ourselves. So each time, and the councils, they know this. The private landlords just keep turning you down. So they have you. And I myself, I'm also got mobility problems because I worked so hard in my business. It's a business where you have to do long-standing, chef work. Okay. So they're making you move around, go around, asking, would you rent to us? Would you rent to us? Knowing that you're going to be turned down because they're not going to be taking people like yourself.
Gosh.
They want people that are working, or they want people that sometimes they have 4 people living in one house, which shoots the price of rents up. So
you're just stuck. I don't want to run out of time, Jenny.
Yeah, me neither. Sorry, sir. What I would like to say. Okay, so then eventually, So then you're made victim to rogue landlords, rogue estate agents.
Of course.
I was made victim by rogue estate agent. I managed to get a house. I was thinking, oh, thank God it's suitable for my family. Thank God. But it was a rogue estate agent that made me believe that the house, because I said to him, it's very important for me to have a house which on a long-term length, because I need stability for my autistic children. Oh, yes, it's fine. This house can be like yours. You can have it for years to come. The landlord is away. He doesn't need it. Not realizing that the landlord only wanted him to rent it out for a short period of time. And he made me victim to this.
Oh,
so
no.
then, while I was thinking I've got a home now for a while, I was then made victim of a no-fault eviction. And the other thing is
go on.
Yeah, sorry, I was paying £400.
Last two more sentences, Jenny.
Yeah, okay. Basically, government needs to build more social housing. Stop making it hard for people to get social housing.
Completely agree.
Stop putting us through this. Life is stressful enough. That's why you're getting all these children that are not in suitable homes, that they're killing one another, and people are suffering from mental health. And you landlords, take into consideration people's situation. Not everybody is not going to pay their rent just because they're on universal credit. And stop charging so much money. You get these landlords that have bought council houses that for £30,000 and they're changing them into six.
Do you feel a bit better now, or not?
Sorry.
No, shush. I just want to make sure that you're glad you did that, because you covered a lot of territory, and I agree with every single word you said, Jenny. Will you take care, yeah? And we'll talk again.
Thank you very much.
Promise we'll talk again. Promise?
Yes, we will.
All right,
we will.
It's 12 noon. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you're still listening, Jenny, an awful lot of love coming in, both for you personally and for the opinions that you shared with us. And I certainly would add my name to that fan club list as well. Before I tell you what we're talking about next, I'm going to get Henry Riley to bring us up to speed with the latest developments in this saga over at the BBC. What's happened today, Henry?
So the BBC have been giving an update. They were due to do so anyway because it's the publication of their annual report, whereby they go through, of course, the licence fee figures and whatnot. But understandably, a lot of the journalists in the room, myself included, keen to ask about the current situation and what the very latest is. So a few headlines that have come out. Firstly, the BBC have paused their internal investigation into the BBC employee involved. That is at the request of the Metropolitan Police. So there is still no investigation by the police, but they are still making inquiries with relation to this, and so therefore the BBC pausing their specific inquiry, but also passing over information to the Metropolitan Police that may be relevant. The other thing to make you aware of, James, is that the first complaint Tim Davie has said. Now there were, of course, this goes back to May, doesn't it? The 19th of May when this first happened. Tim Davie confirming that actually the initial complaint they had was very serious, but that it wasn't criminal, and that's why they didn't act on it initially. So they said at that particular time there was no evidence of any criminality, but they do accept that it was a very serious allegation. They say, though, they had to go through, obviously, the duty of care, obviously all the correct procedures before they could pass that on. Tim Davie also has confirmed that he hasn't spoken with the presenter involved. Now, of course, we don't know who the presenter is, but Tim Davie making it very clear that he has not spoken to that particular individual, but has essentially conceded and made it be known that there is a sort of duty of care involved and that there is support for the particular presenter involved.
And I mean, we should add that overnight, the young person at the centre of these allegations, their lawyers contacted the BBC to say that they deny that anything untoward or illegal had occurred. The claims are totally wrong. The claims made by this person's mother and stepfather to the Sun newspaper were described by the alleged victim of this behaviour as rubbish.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was a twist that I don't think anybody was expecting.
No, definitely. And, it was very clear, wasn't it, from what this has come from, obviously, the lawyer of the individual concerned who's made I suppose he hasn't made the allegation, but the parents have. This is, in this particular case, just to make it clear, James, the Sun have come back to that particular story. They've said, of course, they're doing it on behalf of the mother and the stepfather. It's a tricky one, though.
It was always the interesting element of it for me was the absence of the alleged victim's testimony from the coverage, and therefore perhaps the absence of the name of the accused. It's a mess, and it's hard to see how it gets cleaned up quickly, but we will watch with interest.
And just to say, of course, going on from what you said as well, there was also that allegation from the lawyer that they told the Sun newspaper on Friday evening,
I think,
which would be very significant, because if there was that denial, even to include that as a line in the sort of news article would be considered very important. So they maintaining that actually they did approach the Sun before it went to print and ended up on the front page the next day.
Yes, that would be difficult to account for, I suppose, for the editorial team over at the Sun. Henry Riley, thank you. We may see you again. It's that sort of story. Something else may emerge before 1 o'clock today. And speaking of things that emerged, before I played that clip of Laura Farris being rather charming towards Harriet Harman, I said to the producer, I'll say something nice about a Tory MP, and I'll get a text telling me that she eats children. And here it is. Laura Farris voted against extending free school meals and all sorts of other nasty stuff. There is no such thing as a decent Tory MP. I understand your position. I really do. But I'm not as bleak as you. I just want to believe that there is such a thing as a nice Tory. And I know a few, albeit X. So, yeah, I take your point. And I think we get a little bit caught up sometimes in the nature of the whip in the Commons. You can't not vote for things without essentially incurring the wrath of the whip's office and the leadership and jeopardising your own position. So it's not quite as straightforward as comments like that suggest, but just good to know that my instincts are still sound. There was a fellow in the last hour, I could tell he hadn't listened to any of the programme. I don't know how. It was like a little antennae twitching. And then the camera's on. I just did a little impression there of antennae twitching. I don't want that. I don't want that going viral. And then knowing that as soon as I said something nice, and it was a lovely thing she did, particularly when it's her own colleagues, her own parliamentary colleagues, who've led this disgusting attack on the Privileges Committee and on Harriet Harman. For a Conservative MP to stand up and do what is right is something that we rightly took a moment to recognise. And now we move on to something completely different. Would you like to know how newspapers work? Of course you would. There's a headline in the Telegraph today that reads thus: Labour's private school tax plan will force out 40,000 pupils. And there is a headline in The Guardian today which reports on exactly the same research from exactly the same organisation, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is a think tank, but it's one that discloses all its funding. So once again, we find ourselves recognising the need for a different description for the ones that are completely transparent, as opposed to the ones that are completely opaque. But the headline in The Guardian, looking at exactly the same research: ending private school tax breaks would raise £1.5 billion for state sector, think tank says. It also finds that there would be a relatively limited effect on pupil numbers. If you got the world's tiniest violin out for landlords in the last hour, getting the world's tiniest violin out for people who won't be able to afford the school fees anymore as a consequence of this policy is not going to be much of a stretch, is it? I like this conversation for two reasons. Number one, I'm fascinated by private education. I'm a beneficiary of it, and I am a user of it. If I think of all the things that my late father might come back and haunt me about, if I didn't pay for my children to have the best possible education that they could ever have, then Dad would be there, like Marley's ghost in A Christmas Carol. But I also recognise the fundamental unfairness at the very heart of the issue, and that's what I want to have a conversation about. 40,000 people. It doesn't sound like a lot. £1.5 billion for the state sector does sound like a lot. You'll get the anecdotal stories about when I was at public school. When I was at public school, my parents probably shouldn't have sent me there, financially speaking, especially because my dad sadly lost his job on the Daily Telegraph in my final year there. So they never had that period of good income without the outgoing of the school fees. And certainly if I'd had any power over it, or I had any ability to travel in time and redress the balance, I'd have left. I'd have come out if I'd known, but I didn't, and that's what they wanted. And it's not for me to retrospectively judge on that. But the reality of people who are going without fancy holidays or new cars, it's real to us. It must sound so ridiculous to everybody else when you're looking at people spending tens of thousands of pounds on sending their children to private school and then claiming that they're not well off or they're not wealthy. It must be close to hilarious, right, for you? Because I mean it when I say my parents made enormous sacrifices to send me to that school, because they did. They made enormous sacrifices relative to our reality. So, you know, other friends we had who didn't send their children to posh schools would have had better cars than Dad ever had, and they'd have gone on better holidays, and they probably had a bigger house. So they did make sacrifices. But the idea that they are somehow relevant to people who could never dream of paying school fees, it is just ridiculous. And what I want to stress, because I don't want this to be an unkind conversation, I just want to stress that when you hear people saying stuff like that, well, when I was there, there'd be some parents turned up on a pogo stick because they couldn't afford a car. These people do mean it. They're perhaps a little bit blinkered or a little bit ignorant, a little bit lacking in empathy, incapable of imagining what it would sound like to open up your newspaper or turn on your radio when you're thinking, like the caller we had earlier, when they've just entered skint week, which is the bit of the week where the money's run out before the month has run out, and therefore you're going to be feeding the kids stuff that you'd much rather not be feeding them. And then you turn on your radio and you hear me suggesting that they need that you there with the turkey twizzlers, you should be feeling sorry for that person over there who may no longer be able to afford to send their children to private school. You are so far away from worrying about what you're going to feed the kids or how you're going to pay the electricity bill at the end of the month that it just is. It's a very British condition, this. It's very class-based. It's a consequence, I suspect, of hugely disproportionate right-wing media. And I used to be part of the problem. I want to make that categorically clear. I used to be part of the problem because my parents made genuine sacrifices according to their reality. My mum went without things she would have loved to have had so that I could go to the school that I went to. But I can't ask you to feel sorry for her latter-day equivalent, who may end up being among the 40,000 pupils that now get squeezed out of private school because of the removal of charitable status. I think it's ridiculous. 15 minutes after 12 is the time. So here is the moral question, right? Here is the moral question. It is grossly unfair, right? And that is why it exists. It's why people avail themselves of it. You are buying an advantage for your children. I admire the people who are capable of buying that advantage but choose not to. But I admire them in the same way that I admire people who, I don't know, give away all their money to work with to go and work in a leper colony. I know I'm a decent person. I try to be a good person, but I'm not a saint. I'm not perfect. So my parents did it for me, and I inherited that desire to do whatever you can. We prioritize education over lots and lots of other things. It's a nuanced argument. It's a deeply fallible argument. It's quite a frail and fragile argument, but it's the argument that's there. It's the argument I've got. Here's the bit I don't get, right? And I'm not really interested in the numbers or the money today. If you've got a small constituency of people buying an unfair advantage in society, and it's got as much to do with the networking as it has to do with the education, in my opinion and my experience. If you've got a small number of people buying an unfair advantage for their children, is it better or worse for society in general to make that small constituency smaller? Do you understand what I mean? I don't know. I can't decide. So here are 100 people. Currently, 10 of them have an enormous advantage purchased for them by their parents. And therefore, the society that consists of all 100 is skewed. It is unfair. There's an unfair advantage being enjoyed by 10 out of 100 people. So we wave our magic wand, or we elect Keir Starmer Prime Minister, and for the sake of this argument, that number becomes 5. So you now have 5 people buying an unfair advantage for their children in society. Is society more or less fair than it was when 10 people were buying it? That's my question for you. All right? It's like philosophy there. In fact, I can't. Usually you come up with a question like this, and a little bit of me remembers the model that we studied at university when I was doing philosophy. There'd be like, if there's a train heading towards a town and you can change the signal so that it only the people on the train die and it doesn't crash into a school, would you do it even though, those philosophical conundrums that fascinate us? But this is the question. This is the question. This is the only question I want you to answer. There are a million lazy phone-ins about private education and a million lazy cliches and a million rather silly claims that, we might be among the richest people in the country, but we're not that rich and we need help. And by the way, if you can't afford to feed your children, you should get a better job. So this is the question I have for you. This is the philosophical question that I have for you. Is a society where 5% of parents are buying an unfair advantage for their children a more fair or a less fair society than one where 10% of parents are buying an unfair advantage for their children? 0345. I love this question. Don't let me down. Don't spoil it by not finding it as interesting as I do. 03. You don't have to have any interest in education. You don't have to have children. You don't have to be paying school fees. No, it doesn't matter. Is a society? I'm going to say it again. I'm so pleased with this question we took. I think it's an absolute hummer. What's better? What is more fair? Which society is more fair? The one where 5% of parents are buying an unfair advantage for their children, or the one where 10% of parents are buying an unfair advantage for their children? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 12:19. It is 22 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we're looking at this question and this question only. Is a society where 5% of parents buy an unfair advantage for their children through private education more or less fair than a society where 10% of parents do it? And I can safely and fairly say that at this point in proceedings, I haven't got a clue. Sophia is in Eltham. Sophia, what would you like to say?
I think we need to have an intelligent debate.
Well, we do try every day, Sophia.
And you are great with all your views, James.
Thank you.
I guess to give you some context. So I come from a working class background, grew up on free school meals, and my parents had to scrimp and save, not to send me to independent school, just to survive.
Yes.
And had a good quality state education, was able to go on to university, to graduate, and now just work really hard to be able to send my kids to independent school.
Right.
And I suppose the challenge I have is, I guess, the amount of bashing that independent schools get in the media. If you want to talk about things like social mobility, you want to be able to...
Just hang on. Where do you think they get bashed in the media?
I think they get bashed in terms of there's this elite group of people that
where in the media, not how. Where in the media do you think that happens?
Where in the media do I think that happens? I don't know. When I'm driving along and I hear discussions on the radio or I glimpse something on my phone, I can't name a specific example.
Because I would say 80% of we talked about this at the very top of the show, actually, that because if you are successful in the media and it's a shrinking constituency, then you will be a beneficiary of and quite possibly a parent of privately educated children. The coverage of private education is both disproportionate and hugely positive.
Okay, but maybe I misread it then, or maybe I don't read the same things that you read.
Well, what do you read?
Ooh, James.
So here's the Telegraph. Labour's private school tax plan will force out 40,000 pupils. Let me find what the Mail has to say. So that's, the Mail's your best
I'm a teacher as well, so I'm very busy. I don't have lots of time to read. Go on, tell me.
Okay, well, let's just agree then that the media doesn't actually come down hard on quite the opposite, in fact. These stories, it's a conservative policy. You've got 80% conservative media, and they're going to be warm about this. They're going to be positive.
So I guess essentially the point I want to make, I guess, in terms of your question around is it fairer to have a bigger pool?
Yes.
Well, I guess as a person that does supply work in state schools around London, I think it would be fairer to have a bigger pool, to have as many children in independent schools as possible, alongside trying to raise the standards.
So the more people enjoying the unfair advantage, the fairer society would be.
Do we think it's an unfair advantage? Is it an unfair advantage? Is it an unfair advantage for parents who decide to pay for their children to do ballet lessons or skiing lessons or any other particular skill? Or
well, you'd have to show me whether being good at ballet or good at skiing measurably increases your chances of getting certain levels of recompense, remuneration later in life, whether it improves your chances of networking, all that kind of thing.
But hang
on. So, to answer your question directly, if you've got two little girls that want to be ballerinas and one is having lessons paid for by her parents and one isn't, then yes, the one who's having the lessons, their parents are buying her an unfair advantage. Obviously, I don't understand the question.
But should they be penalised in any way?
But how do you mean penalised? Well, it depends. What if the other ballerina's better?
Well, if the other ballerina's better, then she would get by on her skill, wouldn't she?
Well, that's an unfair advantage for the one who's paying then. So in fact, the only one being penalised, in your example, the only one being penalised is the more talented ballerina.
So how about thinking about all the people you went to school with? Are they all now very successful and working? No,
you can't pretend that people who go to private school don't do better than people who don't. That's why parents pay the fees. This is a fairly pointless argument.
But not wholesale, James.
Well, obviously not wholesale.
But I suppose if they don't wholesale all do better.
But they're probably, even the ones who haven't done brilliant, even the ones who haven't done perhaps as well as they hoped, have probably done better than they would have done if they hadn't gone to private school.
I know people who've been to private schools are Uber drivers. They're not doing very well at all.
Okay. And what do you think that proves?
Well, it proves that it's not just solely about going to independent schools.
No one says it is.
That's going to guarantee you some success.
No one says it is. But this is a conversation about whether or not the advantage that our parents pay for and that we pay for is unfair. And of course it is, by definition. No one's even disputing that.
So do you think that we should just abolish private schools then?
I do, personally. But until they do, I don't blame anybody for taking advantage of the system that's in place.
And do you live in London?
Yes.
And do you live in an area, I don't know where you live, James.
Why are you quizzing me?
No,
you're perfectly entitled to, but the conversation is about your contention, Sophia, that a society in which more people enjoy an unfair advantage is somehow a more fair society than the one in which fewer people do. And I think we both know you can't really justify that.
But I don't think you can justify until you have a system where the state schools are all sort of funded equally.
Yes, but that's why we're not having that conversation today, because I've had these conversations 100 times before. I'm just examining, and in fact, you've helped me realise my opinion on this. No one can with a straight face argue that a society where more people enjoy an unfair advantage is fairer than a society where fewer people do. You just can't. It's just maths.
But I suppose if fewer people, so-called fewer people, enjoy what's being couched as an unfair advantage, and I suppose
what is an unfair advantage? Otherwise, you're wasting your money. What are you paying for? What are you buying?
Me personally, I suppose I'm buying peace of mind. I'm buying.
So that gives you an unfair advantage over people who haven't got peace of mind.
Well, maybe, but I suppose somebody living in Highgate. Just a second. And obviously, as a teacher, I've had the privilege to be able to go into a variety of schools. across London, across the country. And I've seen state schools, I've seen independent schools, and there's such a variation. You could have a state school.
Again, I'm sorry, this is a bit unfair, but this is not the conversation that we're having, and I stressed that from the beginning. We've had this conversation a million times. The only conversation we're having is the one about your contention that society becomes more fair the more people have an unfair advantage.
It's more fair for a child in South East London.
Oh, you're doing it again. This is a philosophical question. Which society is fairer? The one where 10% have an unfair advantage or the one where 5% have an unfair advantage?
Well, I guess it's not for me to determine. Because,
well, why did you ring in? It's 12:30. Amelia Cox is here with the headlines. And Dave's thrown it back up in the air again. He says, surely the 5% would have a greater advantage than if they were sharing that advantage with double the people. So if 10% of parents pay for their children to have a better education, generally speaking, than everybody else, is that a fairer, a more fair or a less fair society than the one where 5% of parents do it? And I missed the point, didn't I? I've missed the utilitarian point here. So if you think of, let's say, a unit of advantage, and we will call it a nugget, right? So a unit of advantage is a nugget. So at the moment, 10% of parents are giving their children 5 nuggets each. There are 50 nuggets in existence. But if you reduce it to 5%, then perhaps those children are getting 10 nuggets each. So there are 50 nuggets of unfair advantage, which means it's exactly the same. But Dave's analysis, whether he realised it or not when he sent me this text, Dave's analysis introduces the possibility of there being more nuggets per child, a greater total number of nuggets when 5% have the unfair advantage than there are when they're 10. Because the people given the golden tickets are now having the golden ticket you get given if you're in the 5% is more than twice as powerful than the golden ticket you get given when you're in the 10%. And I just stress, because I'm not sure Sophia appreciated it, it's a conversation about this philosophical conundrum, not all the usual, and we will have those conversations again about how I'm different and I do it for different reasons and it is not unfair and it's this, that, and I know someone who went to Eton and they drive an Uber and all of that malarkey, but that's not what today's phone-in is about. It's 25-1. Jenny's in Woolwich. Jenny, what would you like to say?
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
You have to bear with me. I have a bit of aphasia.
Okay.
I had a stroke last year and sometimes my words wobble.
Oh, you take your time, Jenny. Take all the time you need.
Thank you. I am a total hypocrite.
So am I.
I've had like basic jobs, have it topped up on income support, but anything I did have, and when they say like work my backside off. My daughter went all the way through to private school on bursaries and scholarships because I was smart to know that they were there.
Yes.
And I drove and applied for everything. So she went all the way through. But when you actually look, if we're talking about the mathematics and the philosophy, if there are fewer children who go through private school, then there's fewer of them to take up all the positions. Because at the moment, if you say that, if we say use the 10% hypotheses, if we say that 10% of the private educated kids take up 65% of the government at the government cabinet.
Yeah, but they can only do one. They can only do one job at a time.
Yes. So there will be fewer people privately educated to take up all these roles.
Yes.
So you could say that having fewer, they will have advantage still, but there'll be fewer of them having the advantage.
And therefore more people without the advantage will access the echelons that are currently almost monopolised by them.
You've got it.
So that's why you're a hypocrite.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
Because
same. I mean, because also I like this as well from Brian, who's in Dulwich. The 5% would be gaining perhaps a greater but shorter-lived advantage in a reforming system. So that even if it went the other way round, that would be reassuring as well.
Yeah, and it's just like it's very your last caller saying, I know people at Eton who like dry
She didn't quite say that. That was me being very unfair.
Oh, right.
She
Okay.
says-
Well, think about it, though. They've probably still got somewhere to live.
Yeah.
They're probably not, I'm not saying like 100%, but probably 99% of them aren't worrying about a mortgage. They're not worrying about eating. They've probably got relatives that they could, put up, or even old school friends that they could go and stay in their pool house.
Their coach house. It depends on what sort of school. Well, you know, and I know that not every fee-paying school, not every independent school is a sort of, Greyfriars or Ampleforth where I went, or Eton College. Some of them are very, very rarefied, and some of them are not. But you can't really argue with two elements of this conversation. The first is that most parents, not you because of the bursaries and the scholarships, but most parents are paying for an advantage that I guess you could possibly argue about whether it's an unfair or advantage or not. But I think you'd struggle.
Totally unfair.
Of course it is. And the second thing is that the fewer people that benefit from it, the better that would be for society as a whole.
Absolutely, because there'd be fewer. It's like my daughter, from having gone to private school, she rarely has to pay for somewhere to stay when she goes on holiday because the friends that she made there, they'll have houses abroad, or they go on whole family holidays, and they're fond of her and they let her tag along. But she knows very well her status there, that she's the poor kid who's charity.
Yeah,
but it's true though, and I wanted her to have all ththose advantages. So excuse me.
No, that's all right. And she then may, when she becomes a mum, possibly the rungs, the socio-economic rungs will have been scaled.
Hopefully. I pray.
Yeah, no, I do.
I'm in my sixth decade, and I pray.
Well, yeah, hang in there. Well done, Jenny. Thank you. I think you've clarified it for me and possibly for other people as well. There's a resistance here. I think I used to suffer from it as well. I used to bridle at the eye because I used to say, my parents worked so hard. They worked so hard and they made so many sacrifices. And you think, yeah, they did work very hard and they did make sacrifices. But for 90% of families in this country, it's an utterly, utterly inconceivable goal. And they're working very, very hard and making all sorts of sacrifices to make sure the kids have got shoes and dinner. And then all the places in between. I'm not suggesting for a minute that So the one fly in the ointment of Jenny's thesis and my increasing conviction on this is the plutocracy argument, the idea that you're heading towards a sort of Hunger Games type scenario. So if you've got 10% with this advantage, then you've got a bigger, let's say, ruling class, loosely speaking. 5% is even worse than 10% because it's even more of a pyramid. I can't quite articulate that, but you sense the thought that I'm framing. It's more plutocratic, it's more feudal. The smaller the ruling class, the less fair the society. Stuart is in Shrewsbury. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing? Yes, so I am a bit confused now because I was originally going to say
you and me both. Go on.
And now I kind of completely understand the sort of 10% aspect. So I'm working class background. Grew up in Handsworth in Birmingham.
Oh yeah.
Didn't have a very good education, particularly. I learned differently to other people. I think I'm much more kind of about experience based rather than sitting through class. So
My daughter had a speech delay, and around here everything is in 30 per class. Even in the nurseries, there's quite a lot.
Yes.
So we decided to invest in a local private school to help a smaller class and all that kind of stuff. I am, very liberal-minded, and I would happily. It would be a struggle, but I'd happily pay more if I knew that it was going to help everyone else and raise them up.
Yes.
So originally I was thinking 5%, of course, if that's how it's going to be and it actually benefits everyone else in the terms of through VAT or whatever it is. But then I think about my daughter, because then there would be people, it is going, if VAT does come along, it is going to be much more of a struggle for us.
Yes, of course.
And then I think about all of the families that I know who are in a similar situation to us, who are putting their kids through private school for different reasons other than it's the best education, because there are lots of kids who have SEND needs who don't always get kind of
but you only compare
out.
For the purposes of these conversations, Stuart, you can only compare those children to children with the same needs in the state system.
Yes.
So so you are getting an unfair advantage.
Yes. Oh no, absolutely. I agree. I agree that I agree. But what I mean is that if there was fewer places, then my daughter might not be able to, or similar families to us might not be able to get that additional help that they're looking for, and end up going into the state system, which I love. I want to add more into it, and I'd happily pay more tax to do so. But we do worry. My son.
No, I know, but we're getting into the individual detail again, aren't we?
Absolutely, I know, I understand,
and it's inevitable. I mean, everyone. That's why I said you can ring in even if you haven't got children, but if you have and they're in it, it's almost impossible to step back far enough to see it completely in the round, to see it in completely objective terms. So I will just ask you then, which society is fairer? The one where 10% of parents are paying for their children to have an advantage, or the one where 5% of parents are paying to have their children to have an advantage? That's all I want to know from you next.
My life. This is a question, isn't it?
I love it.
This is probably the hardest question I've ever been asked. Right, okay, well, it has to be the 5%, I think. That's why I originally called in.
That's fairer. That's the fairer bit, where the fewer people who've got the unfair advantage, the fairer the society is.
Yeah, I think so. I think
so,
I'm going to change my mind in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, I am, because then you've got the possibility they're going to have even more advantage than I don't know, but thank you for your honesty. Everybody, actually, almost. It's coming up to 1:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know whether this is good news or bad news, but the Institute of Fiscal Studies estimates that the number of children being pushed out of private schools if VAT is brought in is a lot lower than some of the estimates. In fact, between 20 to 40,000 pupils. So the headline is 40 in the Telegraph, inevitably, but actually it might just as well have been 20,000. And then, of course, immediate downside to that is they will be the ones from the least privileged backgrounds who currently access privilege. So it's like a drawbridge, isn't it, or a portcullis coming down. But I think you're going to struggle to argue that the fairer society is the one where the more people have the unfair advantage. But there's 15 minutes to go. 12:49 is the time. Sometimes the producer falls out of love with my funny ideas before I do. So that's why we didn't do it yesterday. But I think we should do it today. Dorries. It is now 32 days since Nadine Dorries promised to step down as an MP with immediate effect. Comedy pause. Nadine Dorries is still an MP. Dorries. Very high-tech, that production it's called. That is. It's very nice. Young students of radio will be wondering what software we used to put that together and to get it so slick and span, but there it is. Back to the question. Which society is fairer? The one where 5% of parents are paying for their children to have an educational advantage, or the one where 10% of parents are? Jane's in Gloucester. Jane, what do you reckon?
Hello, Brian. It's lovely to talk to you. Basically, I think 5%, and nobody could say anything that would persuade me differently.
What if the advantage and the privilege that the 5% get is more than double the advantage and the privilege that the 10% were getting before?
Well, I can't quite believe that, because it's about numbers. So you've got, fewer numbers of people going out there having that advantage. And the other argument is we have to get rid of private schools. Until we do that, the state schools will never be good enough, and equality in society will go on. So the fewer number you have, you're edging in the right direction.
And so squeezing more and more people out of it, even as the people still there continue to enjoy accelerated advantage, is for the greater good of society.
Yes, because you still have fewer people going out there having that advantage.
I think it's a utilitarian argument, although I may have forgotten my Jeremy Bentham from college. And for the people who, that's the problem, isn't it? With everything that's designed for the greater good or the general good, there are going to be people at the sharp end of it. So for the 20 to 40,000 pupils whose parents won't be able to afford it anymore, it's a little bit tough, Jane, but you're just saying hard cheese, aren't you, really?
Yeah, it is hard cheese, because they're going to be really good parents. They want to do the best for their kids. They're going to give them extra tuition themselves.
That's true. They'll be quite sharp-elbowed, probably. That's not always true. I mean, the really, really posh kids I went to school with, their parents weren't even sure what their names were. That's where you had the real sort of children should be sooner not heard. But for the middle-class parents who do it, then yes, you're right. It is. They're probably going to be a great benefit to the state schools that their children end up going to as well.
Absolutely. And they'll campaign relentlessly to get the improvements in education for all of the children, which is what we need.
Nicely put, Jane. Thank you. A couple of, actually, you won't get through if you try, so I won't give you the phone number. Gillian Kent says independent education should be available to all those who choose it and who can afford it. Well, it will be, Jill. That's the point. You go, a tax applied to fees is no guarantee from the Labour Party that they would invest it in state education. Well, they've said that they would, so whether you take it on trust or not. But the first line, in many ways, undermines the rest of what you've written. Independent education should be available to all those who choose it and who can afford it. That holds true even if only 3 people in the country can afford it. It is available to everyone who can afford it. And tomorrow, fewer people will be able to afford it than today. And next year, even fewer. And the year after that, even fewer. So the slow grind towards a place where everything is more equal and more fair continues, possibly. Mo's in Birmingham. Mo, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Thank you for taking my call.
You're most welcome.
To buck the trend, I actually think having 10% of people going to independent school is a better outcome than the 5%. And so I think explain my thinking behind it.
Go on.
We live in a country that beautifies the class divide, worships it actually, worships the accents of people who are perceived to be posh. And if you use your 10% analogy, that 10% consists of people who I believe are undeserving of that privilege, the privilege of this class worship, and who actually are deserving, people who are from a good background of a good,
This would be my late father's argument, actually. So you're on fairly safe territory here that I'm not going to come after you with an old broomstick.
Yeah. Now,
the more people that get the golden ticket, the more we are chipping away at the people who weren't born into it but get it via education. The more we're chipping away at the edifice of the class system. Is what you're saying.
And I think if it was to shrink to 5% here, I think there will be a higher proportion of the undeserving people who have paid for that privilege getting, remaining in that privilege. So I'd rather have more. It's a numbers game for me here. I'd rather have more good people having that opportunity to have the privilege of private education. And until we actually destroy this edifice of worshipping this class system that we have here, that worships, and private school education is part of that.
Of course it is. It's one of the biggest parts. It's one of the biggest parts of it.
Yeah, until we have that, people have that.
Yeah, but that's the problem, isn't it? So at the end there, you've kind of conceded that you wouldn't be creating a fairer society. You would just be spreading the unfairness around a little bit more evenly.
Yeah, I personally think it is to actually to dilute the damage caused by that undeserving.
Yeah. No, I like your argument. I disagree with it. And you've inevitably made it quite nuanced by making it specific to the British class system rather than my slightly ambitious attempt to make it largely numerical and statistical, because you can't really argue that giving an advantage to 10 people is more fair than giving it to 5 people.
Yeah, well, it's a symptom of the society.
That's the best challenge. So it was interesting because Jane, who was on before you, saw it absolutely crystal clear, binary. No way could you possibly persuade me that it is the other way around. But if you really bring in variables, you bring in unique British facets, class, whatever, deference, then you have a case. Not a case I agree with, but I can see exactly where you're coming from. And I think that is how I was raised. It's not, I mean, it is unfair, but the more people like me that go to private school, the more the mystique and the stranglehold of people from very privileged backgrounds upon the reins of society, the chains of power, the more it is diminished. I don't think that has been borne out by events, really. 12:56 is the time. Sarah's in Amersham. Sarah, what would you like to say?
I think that, thank you for taking my call, by the way.
Most welcome.
I think that I live in a different kind of area where my eldest son has got a bursary to the local school and prep school.
Yeah.
And we do actually pay for the other one.
Okay.
And because it's kind of like a scholarship bursary. But at that prep school, there's basically 2% who are eligible for free school lunches, whereas at the local grammar school, there's less than 1% who are eligible. Yes. And so what's interesting there is that I think that with all these schools, the advantage of him going to this private school and having, for him, is that I don't have to drive to all the different clubs and things because he's doing it all in school.
Yes.
For all the various things he's doing. Whereas I think around here, I've got friends who live in £3 million houses and their kids get free transport to school, to the local school, because they can't walk there. And it's not, there's no sort of a proper balance here. And yet if there's a 20% raise, I wouldn't be able to afford it for my second son.
No.
But we're okay here because actually, if you go to local state school, I think it's almost better than the other schools. Because we've got all the grammar schools around here. And
I see what you mean. So that's a different measure. It's good that you've reminded us of it. I mean, I'm not going to give you a ticking off for steering and veering away from my carefully phrased philosophical conundrum. But if you're moving to an area, a catchment area of a non-fee-paying school with an exceptional academic record, then you're using your money differently. But you're using it to move into a catchment area as opposed to simply paying the school fees. And I see them as morally very similar, actually. I don't think you get a different moral result by simply being able to afford a house in an area than you do by simply being able to afford school fees. So, no, of course it's nuanced, Sarah. Will it happen? We'll have to wait and see. That is it for today. We'll do it all again tomorrow. I enjoyed that a lot. I quite some funny stuff coming in as well. People pointing out not only did I manage to stay patient when several phone lines went down, but I also, for the first time in history, didn't tick someone off when they called me Brian. I've never done that, but just let it go, let it slide. And then there was an actual Brian who was very cross with me because he said if a man had rang in to make the points that Sophia made about private education, I would have torn him a new one, but I always go easier on women. So I'm getting abuse now for being so nice and kind and equable. What can you do? If you missed any of today's show, perhaps you want to check. We could use it like VAR. You could go back over the whole show and decide for yourself whether or not I was unfair towards any of the callers that we've dealt with, including Jane, who called me Brian. You can listen back on Global Player, where you can also rewind live radio. You'll also find all of LBC's shows there to catch up on, as well as the best video clips from LBC and other global stations. So rewind live radio on Global Player. Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty is is with you now.
Thanks, Brian. At 3 today. I had to do it. Just had to. 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 Just had to.